Hello there, and welcome to Biology with Charles, where science softens its voice a little, the pace slows down, and complicated things become easier to sit with at the end of the day. Tonight, we're settling in with a question that tends to show up in the middle of ordinary life, often without much warning. You eat, and then somehow you still want more. You tell yourself you're probably not truly hungry, and yet the feeling hangs around anyway. It can be a strange thing, hunger. Sometimes it arrives like a clear knock at the door. Other times it behaves more like an overly familiar guest who lets itself in, opens the fridge and starts making suggestions. So before we ease into this quiet little investigation, I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight and what kind of hour it is in your part of the world. Maybe it's late and the house is finally quiet. Maybe you're under a blanket trying to let the day loosen its grip. If you find this soothing or helpful or simply a gentle place to rest your thoughts for a while, I'd be very grateful if you gave the video a like and maybe subscribed as well. It helps this calm little corner reach other people who may need something steady and thoughtful before sleep. Now then, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop a bit, and we'll begin with one of the most persistent signals the body can send, because hunger is not always loud, but it is very rarely simple. Most people grow up with a fairly basic idea of hunger. The stomach gets empty, it sends a complaint, and then you eat. That story is neat, tidy, and very incomplete. Real hunger is not managed by one organ, one signal, or one straightforward switch. It is a conversation happening all the time between the stomach, the intestines, fat tissue, the brain, the bloodstream, sleep, stress, habits, memory, reward, and the strange little routines that quietly shape daily life. By the time you feel the urge to eat, many things have already been happening behind the scenes. Hormones have shifted, nerve signals have travelled. The brain has been checking energy status, scanning the environment, matching smells and sights with past experience, and deciding whether the body needs fuel, expects fuel, or simply wants the comfort that food can provide. That is one of the most important things to understand at the beginning. Feeling hungry does not always mean the same thing. Sometimes it means your body truly needs energy. Sometimes it means your brain expects a meal because it is noon, and noon has been lunch for years. Sometimes it means you slept badly, and your internal chemistry has become more interested in quick calories than it usually is. Sometimes it means stress has bent your appetite in one direction or the other. Sometimes it means you ate, but the systems that help generate fullness did not communicate especially well. Hunger can be biological, learned, emotional, environmental, and hormonal all at once. The body does not separate these categories as neatly as we do. When people say they cannot stop feeling hungry, they often feel as if something is wrong with their willpower. They may imagine that somewhere inside them there is a character flaw wearing a name tag that says poor self-control. Biology is usually much less judgmental than that. The body is not trying to ruin your plans. It is trying to keep you alive in an environment that is often confusing by historical standards. For most of human existence, food was not always available, and high-calorie food was not sitting in bright packaging on shelves under perfect lighting at every hour of the day. The brain systems that regulate hunger were built for uncertainty, scarcity, and effort. They were built to push hard when energy might be hard to find. In a world where food is abundant, engineered to be highly appealing and constantly visible, those same systems can become noisy and difficult to manage. At the simplest level, hunger is part of energy regulation. Your body is always using fuel. Even when you're lying still, breathing quietly, and doing absolutely nothing impressive, your cells are busy, the brain is working, the heart is working, temperature is being maintained, ions are moving across membranes, tissue is being repaired, proteins are being built and broken down. Life is expensive in a quiet, continuous way. Because of that, the body needs mechanisms for tracking incoming energy and stored energy. It also needs a way to make behavior happen. That is where hunger becomes so interesting. It is not just information, it is motivation. It is the body translating internal status into a feeling strong enough to move you toward food. This feeling can seem simple when it appears as a stomachache or a hollow sensation. But even that familiar emptiness is only one part of the story. Hunger is not located neatly in the stomach. The brain, especially regions involved in homeostasis and reward, plays an enormous role in generating the experience. The stomach can be physically full, and yet the mind can remain interested in eating. On the other hand, a person can be running low on energy and barely notice hunger at all during periods of stress or distraction. The body signals are real, but they are interpreted through a nervous system that is constantly balancing many priorities. Imagine for a moment that your body is less like a car with a fuel gauge and more like a house run by a committee. One member watches stored supplies in the pantry. Another keeps track of what is being used right now. Another stands near the front window and gets excited every time a delivery truck goes by. Another remembers that every evening at 8 there used to be dessert. Another is tired and irritable because no one slept well last night. Another is anxious and wants something comforting immediately. This committee is not calm, and it is not always in agreement. Yet together, it produces what you experience as appetite, fullness, craving, or the persistent sense that eating would somehow make things better. Two of the most famous members of this committee are leptin and ghrelin, the hormones in our title. They have become almost celebrity hormones in nutrition conversations, sometimes discussed as if they alone decide whether a person eats or stops eating. They do not act alone, but they matter a great deal because they help the brain interpret the state of the body. Ghrelin is often described as a hunger hormone. It tends to rise before meals and signal that it may be time to eat. Leptin is often described as a fullness or satiety signal, produced largely by fat tissue, helping inform the brain about longer-term energy stores. These descriptions are useful starting points, but only starting points. Neither hormone is a magical on-off button. They are better understood as messengers in a larger network, and like many messengers, their words can be amplified, ignored, distorted, or drowned out by the rest of the room. Before we get too technical with them, it helps to sit with a more basic truth. Hunger is meant to feel persuasive. If the body's energy needs could be dismissed as easily as a weak reminder notification, our species would not have done very well. Hunger has to matter. It has to interrupt. It has to return. It has to make food seem worth pursuing. In a harsh environment, that is not a design flaw. That is survival. The problem is that the same persuasive force can become exhausting when it operates in a modern environment, filled with constant cues and constant options. To the ancient body, available food might have meant a seasonal fruit tree, a successful hunt, or something cooked after real effort. To the modern body, it can mean a pastry by the checkout, an app with delivery in 20 minutes, the smell from the bakery downstairs, or the fact that your kitchen is only a few steps away. The brain is not merely monitoring calories with detached scientific interest. It is also asking what kind of food is available, how rewarding it might be, how certain its arrival is, and whether it would be smart to eat now in case food is less available later. Reward matters enormously here. A plain boiled potato and a bag of very salty, crunchy, highly processed snacks do not create the same cascade of interest, anticipation, and momentum, even if both contain energy. The brain's reward pathways are part of the hunger story because they influence how strongly food captures attention, and how difficult it is to stop once eating begins. This does not mean hunger is imaginary. It means hunger is tied to motivation, and motivation is shaped by more than raw need. There is also the matter of prediction. The body is constantly learning patterns. If you regularly eat at certain times, hormones and neural signals can begin preparing for food before the first bite appears. That means hunger can arrive because your body has learned that eating usually happens now. This is not fake hunger. It is anticipatory hunger, and it can feel very real because the body is trying to coordinate digestion, blood sugar handling, and behavior efficiently. Humans are pattern-making creatures. If lunch is usually at 1, the system starts getting ready before 1. If something sweet usually follows dinner, interest in sweetness may arrive on schedule, whether or not your energy stores truly demand it. This is one reason people can feel confused when they change eating habits. A new routine does not only challenge preference, it challenges expectation. The body may continue sending familiar signals for a while because it has learned a rhythm, and does not abandon that rhythm just because the conscious mind has made a new plan on Monday morning with admirable seriousness. Biology often nods politely at our intentions and then continues doing what it was doing until sufficient evidence suggests the pattern has actually changed. Another thing people often notice is that hunger is not steady. It comes in waves. That can seem odd if we imagine it as a direct, simple measure of emptiness, but it makes sense once we remember that hunger is hormonal, neural, and psychological. A wave can build, peak, and then settle. Attention can amplify it, distraction can soften it, a smell can wake it up again, stress can sharpen it, water can temporarily blur it, sleep loss can make it louder than expected. The body is dynamic, not linear. It is always adjusting, always interpreting. If you have ever had a day where you felt hungry soon after a large meal, or oddly uninterested in food after many hours without eating, then you have already met this complexity in your own life. A large meal does not guarantee lasting fullness if it is built in a way that does not produce strong satiety signals for you. A stressful day can suppress appetite in one person and intensify it in another. A short night of sleep can make ordinary hunger feel bigger, more urgent, and strangely fixated on calorie-dense foods. The body's energy system is not just a fuel tank, it is a living negotiation. There is also a difference between fullness and satisfaction, and this difference causes trouble more often than people realize. Fullness is a physical state. Satisfaction is more psychological and sensory. You can be physically full but not satisfied if the meal did not match what your brain was expecting or wanting. That can leave the door open to continued seeking. On the other hand, a meal can feel satisfying but not keep you physically full for very long. The body cares about nutrients, volume, fibre, protein, fats, timing and hormonal response. The mind cares about taste, texture, expectation, comfort, familiarity and reward. Very often, both are speaking at once. All of this means that persistent hunger should not be treated as a moral failure or a simple lack of discipline. It is usually a clue. It may be a clue about meal composition, sleep, stress, routine, food environment, or the body's signalling systems. It may be a clue that the brain is receiving strong hunger signals and weak fullness signals. It may be a clue that reward is overshadowing regulation. It may be a clue that certain hormones are behaving in ways that make appetite harder to ignore. What matters first is curiosity. The body is not random. Even when it feels frustrating, it is usually making sense according to rules that are just not obvious yet. And that is why leptin and ghrelin matter so much in this story. They help explain why hunger is not merely about the emptiness of the stomach. Ghrelin helps announce the approach of eating, making food feel relevant, timely, and difficult to ignore. Leptin helps report on stored energy, telling the brain something about whether the body has reserves. In a well-coordinated system, these signals contribute to a rhythm that makes sense. Hunger rises, food is found, eating occurs, fullness develops, and the brain settles. But systems are rarely perfect, and modern life is extremely good at nudging them off balance. Poor sleep can shift them, chronic stress can distort them, weight changes can influence them, highly palatable foods can work around them. Repeated dieting can affect the landscape in which they operate, and the brain, always protective, often responds more urgently to the possibility of energy shortage than to the possibility of energy excess. That last point is worth resting on for a moment. From an evolutionary point of view, being slightly too hungry was often safer than being slightly too indifferent to food. A body that encourages eating when energy might become scarce has a survival advantage in uncertain conditions. A body that casually ignores falling energy stores is taking a bigger risk. This means the systems around hunger and fullness are not neutral. They tend to err on the side of preservation. They are biased towards survival. In today's world, that bias can feel inconvenient, but in the long story of life, it was protective. So when someone says, "I don't know why I'm always hungry," the answer is almost never, "because you are weak." The answer is usually closer to, because your body is running ancient survival software in a very modern environment, and several signals may be pushing harder than you realize. That is a much kinder answer, and it also happens to be more accurate. Over the next stretch of this story, we're going to look more closely at where these signals begin, how the body builds the feeling of hunger before you consciously name it, and why that quiet nudge toward food can become surprisingly strong even when you think you should be fine, because hunger rarely starts at the moment you notice it. By then, the conversation has already been underway for some time, and one of the earliest voices to speak is the one that rises before meals and starts gently, persistently asking the brain to pay attention. A strange thing about hunger is that it usually feels as though it begins all at once. One moment you are occupied with something else, and the next there it is, a definite pull toward food, a thought that keeps returning, a sense that eating has moved from optional to necessary. But the feeling you notice is only the surface. Hunger tends to begin much earlier than that, quietly and in stages, long before the conscious mind puts a name to it. By the time you say to yourself, "I'm getting hungry," your body has already been preparing the message. Signals have been changing in the bloodstream. Nerves have been carrying information from the stomach and intestines. The brain has been comparing what is happening now with what usually happens at this hour, with what was eaten earlier, with how well you slept, how stressed you are, how much energy has been used, and what kinds of food might be close at hand. The feeling seems sudden only because most of the preparation happens in silence. This is part of what makes hunger so interesting and, at times, so frustrating. It is not simply a reaction to an empty stomach, it is a forecast, a negotiation, and a bit of an educated guess. The body is not waiting passively until fuel runs out and then sounding an alarm like a dramatic theatre manager. It is predicting future needs, trying to keep blood sugar within a workable range, protecting the brain, and encouraging behaviour before a true shortage becomes a problem. Hunger begins early for the same reason most well-run systems do not wait until the last second to respond. The body prefers anticipation over crisis. It likes to stay ahead of trouble, even if that means it occasionally speaks before the conscious mind thinks the message is necessary. Consider how odd the alternative would be. If the body only told you to eat when energy was critically low, daily life would be a mess. Concentration would collapse before lunch. Mood would nosedive without warning. People would become unreliable, shaky, irritable little creatures, wandering through kitchens in increasing confusion. The body avoids this by using layers of guidance. Some are short-term signals tied to the timing of meals and the state of digestion. Others reflect longer-term energy stores. Some are linked to hormones, some to nerves, some to learned routines, and some to the brain's reward systems. Together they create the feeling we call hunger, but they do so gradually, like several musicians joining a piece one by one before the full song's obvious. One of the first things to understand is that the body learns patterns with remarkable efficiency. If you usually eat breakfast at 8, lunch at 1, and something in the evening, your internal systems begin adapting to that schedule. Hormones do not only respond to food once it arrives, they can rise in anticipation of food because your body has learned that eating tends to happen around certain times. This means hunger can begin before there is any urgent energy shortage at all. It can start because the body is preparing for a familiar event, adjusting digestion, nudging attention toward food, and saying, in effect, "This is the hour when nourishment usually appears, so let us get ready." That preparation is sensible. Digestion is not a switch that flips instantly. Saliva changes, the stomach adjusts, hormonal signals begin shaping appetite and metabolism. Blood flow shifts. The body is an anticipatory machine, and anticipation is useful. But because it is useful, it can also be persuasive. A person may feel genuinely hungry at the usual lunch hour even after a large breakfast, not because the system is broken, but because the system has learned a rhythm and often prefers to keep it. Routine is powerful. The body trusts repeated experience more than a single day's intentions. This is why hunger sometimes appears almost on schedule, like a regular visitor who prides itself on punctuality. You do not have to stare at a clock for the body to know the general pattern. There are internal clocks, daily rhythms, and learned associations all working together. Smell can contribute too. Sight certainly can. The simple act of passing a bakery each morning can become a cue, one that teaches the brain to anticipate a reward and prepares the body accordingly. Over time, the cue itself begins to matter almost as much as the food. You're not imagining this when it happens. The system has simply become efficient at linking environment and appetite. That efficiency helps explain something many people notice but do not always understand. Hunger is often strongest when it is expected, visible, or suggested. A person can be busy for hours and hardly notice appetite, then suddenly feel quite hungry the moment food is mentioned, seen, or smelled. This does not mean hunger was fake before and real afterward. It means the signal was building quietly, and a cue from the environment helped the conscious mind notice it all at once. The feeling seems to appear from nowhere, but in truth it was already forming. The cue merely brought it into focus. A useful comparison might be the way you sometimes become aware of background music only after it changes. It was there all along, but your mind was not attending to it. Hunger often works in a similar way. The body may already be shifting toward food seeking, but until something highlights that shift, the conscious mind continues with whatever it was doing. Then a smell, a memory, a time cue, or a passing thought lifts the signal into awareness. Suddenly you feel hungry, but the beginning happened earlier. The stomach plays an important role here, though not the only one. As digestion from a previous meal winds down, the stomach empties, stretches less, and begins communicating differently with the brain. Nerves linking the gut and brain continuously exchange information. The gut is not just a passive tube waiting to be filled. It is an active sensory organ, constantly reporting mechanical stretch, chemical content, and timing. If the last meal was digested quickly, if it was low in protein or fibre, if it created only a brief sense of fullness, the quiet return of appetite may happen sooner than expected. The stomach may not be dramatically empty, but the absence of fullness itself can already change the conversation. Then there is ghrelin, one of the body's better-known signals related to hunger. Ghrelin is often described as the hunger hormone, and while that title is a little too tidy for the full truth, it earns the reputation honestly enough. Ghrelin is produced mainly in the stomach, and its levels tend to rise before meals and fall after eating. This pattern makes it especially interesting because it shows that hunger can be timed and anticipatory. Ghrelin does not simply surge when the body is in crisis. It often rises in expectation, helping turn food from a neutral idea into something that feels relevant, appealing, and worthy of attention. When ghrelin rises, it influences brain regions involved in appetite and reward. That means the feeling is not just physical. Food begins to stand out more. Thoughts about eating become stickier. The brain pays closer attention to food cues. This is one reason hunger can shift from a mild background sensation to a more deliberate focus without much warning. The body is not only signalling need, it is shaping motivation. It is saying that food should move up the priority list now. What makes this especially important is that ghrelin is not working in isolation. It interacts with other signals and with context. A person who slept poorly may have hunger signals that feel louder than usual. A person under chronic stress may experience appetite in a more erratic way. Someone who has been dieting hard may find that the body becomes more alert to food, more vigilant about hunger, and more reluctant to feel satisfied. The first whisper of hunger is therefore not just a chemical event. It is a hormonal signal meeting a particular body, in a particular environment, on a particular day, under a particular set of conditions. This is why the same person can experience appetite so differently from one day to the next. On one day, breakfast carries them easily through the morning. On another, they're rummaging for something else by 10:30 and wondering what went wrong. Perhaps they slept less. Perhaps yesterday's meals were lighter. Perhaps stress hormones are shifting things. Perhaps their previous meal was digested faster than they realized. Perhaps the office had pastries out early, and the brain began preparing before the body truly needed energy. None of these possibilities is mysterious once you remember that hunger begins before awareness does. The conscious feeling is the end result of a process, not the beginning of it. Blood sugar also contributes, though again not in the simplistic way people often imagine. The body works hard to keep glucose within a useful range, especially because the brain depends heavily on it. As time passes after a meal, the body moves through various metabolic adjustments. It draws on stored sources, shifts hormone levels, and manages energy distribution. Mild changes can contribute to the growing relevance of food, even before anything dramatic occurs. The body does not like uncertainty when it comes to energy for essential functions, so it begins steering behavior early. Hunger is part of that steering. It is a nudge away from future instability and toward timely refueling. There is a nice practicality to this, even if it sometimes feels inconvenient. The body is not waiting for low energy to become a disaster. It is managing risk. It is behaving like someone who starts looking for an umbrella when the clouds gather rather than after the downpour begins. From the point of view of survival, early signals are smart. From the point of view of someone trying not to snack before dinner, they can feel unhelpfully proactive. The brain's own role in this is worth sitting with for a moment, because the experience of hunger is built there as much as anywhere else. A region called the hypothalamus is especially important in energy regulation. It receives information about hormones, nutrients, and stored energy, and it helps coordinate responses. But the hypothalamus is not operating alone in some sealed chamber of pure reason. Reward circuits, memory circuits, attention systems, and emotional networks all contribute. Hunger is not merely computed, it is experienced. That experience is shaped by whether food seems available, whether it has been rewarding in the past, whether the situation feels safe, whether the body is tired, whether stress is pushing for comfort, and whether habit is involved. Because of that, the first whisper of hunger is often a mix of sensation and suggestion. You may notice a faint emptiness in the stomach, but you may also simply find yourself thinking about lunch more often. Perhaps concentration becomes a little more brittle. Perhaps snacks begin to sound like an excellent idea in a way they did not 20 minutes ago. Perhaps foods that were easy to ignore now seem oddly vivid. These are not separate from hunger, they are part of it. Hunger includes bodily sensation, yes, but it also includes the shifting of attention toward food. The mind begins orbiting the idea. The whisper is not always a growl in the abdomen. Sometimes it is a change in what becomes mentally sticky. That mental stickiness is especially noticeable when food is highly rewarding. Sweet, salty, fatty, crunchy, familiar foods can pull harder on attention once hunger begins to rise. This is one reason hunger can feel very general at first and then suddenly specific. At first, you are just a little hungry. A few minutes later, you're not merely interested in eating. You're interested in that particular thing. The body's broad signal has met the brain's reward map, and together they have produced a more focused desire. Again, this does not mean the hunger was invented by the mind. It means the mind helped shape its direction. The environment is astonishingly good at taking a whisper and turning it into a full conversation. A television advertisement, a social media video of melted cheese doing entirely too much, the smell of fresh bread from the shop downstairs, someone at work opening a packet of crisps, all these can amplify appetite because the body is already primed. Food cues do not create hunger out of nothing, but they can push a modest early signal into the foreground. In a way, modern life is full of microphones for appetite. The body whispers, and the world leans in with a speaker system. This matters because many people judge themselves harshly for becoming hungry in food-rich environments, as if the correct biological response would be calm indifference. That would be a lovely trick, but it is not how the system evolved. The human brain is supposed to notice calorie-dense food. It is supposed to find it meaningful. It is supposed to connect sight and smell with potential reward. A world full of visible, convenient, energy-rich food is not neutral. It keeps pressing on the systems that begin hunger before you consciously register it. That does not make self-regulation impossible, but it does mean appetite is often managing more input than people appreciate. Stress complicates this further, not always in the same direction, which is why stress and appetite can seem confusing. Acute stress can suppress hunger in some cases, because the body temporarily prioritizes immediate action. But chronic stress often behaves differently. It can disrupt sleep, alter hormones, change reward sensitivity, and increase interest in comforting foods. Under these conditions, the first whisper of hunger may come sooner, sound louder, or attach itself more strongly to specific foods. The body under strain is not only looking for energy, it is often looking for relief. Food can become attached to that search in ways that feel very compelling. Sleep loss deserves its own respect here because it is such a reliable agitator of appetite. When people sleep badly, hunger often begins earlier and feels harder to ignore. Part of the reason involves changes in appetite-related hormones, including Ghrelin and Leptin, but another part involves the brain becoming more reactive to food cues, while self-regulation feels more effortful. A tired brain is often more interested in quick reward and less interested in patience. So the whisper becomes noticeable sooner, and by the time it reaches awareness, it may already be carrying more force than usual. This is why poor sleep can make ordinary eating patterns feel unexpectedly difficult. The body has shifted the playing field before breakfast has even arrived. Memory and emotion also sneak into the early stages of hunger more than people realize. Food is not only fuel, it is routine, culture, comfort, celebration, distraction, nostalgia, and company. The body may begin with a metabolic signal, but the mind quickly joins in with remembered associations. Afternoon hunger may become entangled with the memory of tea and biscuits. Evening appetite may carry the shape of unwinding on the sofa. A certain sadness may make specific foods feel not only appealing, but appropriate, as if they belong to the moment. By the time the conscious feeling appears, it contains more than biology, though biology remains at its core. This is why learning to notice the early stages of hunger can be surprisingly helpful. Not to judge them or suppress them, but simply to recognize that they are building long before they become loud. There is often a subtle period when appetite is still flexible. You may notice food becoming more interesting. You may sense that focus is fading a bit. You may start opening the fridge with a sort of hopeful vagueness, as if the answer might announce itself from the shelves. That stage is informative. It tells you that the system is moving toward food seeking. It gives you a glimpse of the whisper before it becomes the speech. And that whisper is important because once it grows strong enough, the body becomes more persuasive. Decisions that felt reasonable an hour earlier can become harder to maintain. Patience gets thinner. Portion sizes quietly expand. Foods chosen under strong hunger are often different from foods chosen under mild hunger. This is not because character evaporates. It is because hunger is designed to alter behavior. It is supposed to increase the value of food, narrow attention, and make eating feel urgent enough to happen. The later you notice it, the more it has already shaped the field. Still, the goal is not to fear hunger, or to treat it as an enemy sneaking around the mind. Hunger is healthy. Hunger is necessary. The point is simply that it begins earlier and more quietly than most people assume. It starts with changes in the gut, in hormones, in metabolic rhythm, in learned expectation, in attention, and in the brain's forecast of what may soon be needed. By the time it reaches language, it has already travelled through many layers of the body. That also means the first whisper is not always a trustworthy guide to how much food is truly needed. It is the beginning of a signal, not a precise instruction. The body is saying, notice this, prepare for this, move toward food. It is not always saying crisis. But because the brain is wired to take hunger seriously, even early signals can feel compelling. That seriousness is part of how the system protects you. The body would rather speak a bit early than too late. In the next part of this story, we can look more closely at the messenger that often helps start that early conversation. The hormone that rises before meals, makes food feel more relevant, and helps explain why the thought of eating can begin to gather force before you fully realise it's happening. If you were to pause at just the right moment before a meal, somewhere in that quiet stretch when food has not yet appeared, but your thoughts have begun drifting in that direction, there is a good chance that one of the most active voices inside your body is not your stomach in the simple sense people often imagine, but a hormone moving through your bloodstream, quietly increasing its presence and gently adjusting how your brain feels about food. That hormone is ghrelin, and while it is often introduced as the hunger hormone, the reality is a little more nuanced and in many ways more interesting. Ghrelin does not shout. It does not slam into your awareness like a sudden alarm. It behaves more like a suggestion that gains confidence over time. It rises, it circulates, and it interacts with the brain in ways that make food seem more important, more noticeable, and more worth pursuing. By the time you consciously think, I should eat, ghrelin has often already been at work, shaping that thought from the background. Most of ghrelin is produced in the stomach, though smaller amounts come from other parts of the body. Its levels are not static. They rise and fall in a pattern that often mirrors your eating habits. If you tend to eat at regular times, ghrelin begins increasing before those times arrive, as if your body is preparing for a predictable event. This is one of the clearest examples of how hunger is not simply a reaction to emptiness, but a learned rhythm. The body anticipates, adjusts, and nudges behavior accordingly. This anticipatory nature can feel almost uncanny. You might notice that you become hungry at nearly the same time each day, even if the previous meal was large. It is tempting to interpret that as a failure of fullness or a mistake in the system, but it is often the opposite. It is the system working efficiently, preparing digestion, signalling the brain, and aligning behavior with routine. Ghrelin is part of that preparation. It helps create a sense of readiness, making the idea of eating feel appropriate at that moment. When ghrelin rises, it does more than create a vague sense of hunger. It interacts with specific areas of the brain, particularly those involved in appetite regulation and reward. The hypothalamus, which plays a central role in maintaining energy balance, responds to ghrelin by increasing appetite signals. At the same time, regions associated with motivation and reward become more sensitive to food cues. This means food does not just feel necessary, it becomes interesting. It captures attention more easily. It stands out in a way it did not an hour earlier. This shift in attention is one of the most noticeable effects of ghrelin, though it is rarely recognized as such. You may find yourself thinking about food more frequently, noticing smells more clearly, or feeling a stronger pull towards certain types of food. This is not simply imagination. It is the brain adjusting priorities in response to a hormonal signal. Ghrelin is helping decide what matters right now, and for the moment, food has moved higher on the list. It is also worth noticing that ghrelin does not operate with strict logic in the way people sometimes expect. It does not measure your exact calorie needs and then send a perfectly calibrated signal that matches them. It works more broadly, influenced by patterns, timing, sleep, stress, and previous intake. This is why hunger can feel stronger or weaker on different days, even when your behavior seems similar. Ghrelin is responding not just to what you've eaten, but to the wider context of your body and your habits. Sleep, for example, has a clear effect on ghrelin levels. When sleep is reduced or disrupted, ghrelin tends to rise higher than usual. This can make hunger feel more persistent and more urgent, particularly for calorie-dense foods. At the same time, signals related to fullness may become less effective. The result is a body that feels more driven to eat, even when energy needs have not changed dramatically. Many people notice this without knowing the mechanism. After a poor night of sleep, appetite often feels different, more insistent, less easily satisfied. Ghrelin is one of the reasons for that shift. Stress can influence this system as well, though not always in the same direction. In some situations, acute stress can temporarily suppress appetite, but ongoing stress often leads to more complicated changes. Hormonal signals become less predictable, reward pathways become more active, and food can take on a different role, not just as fuel, but as a form of relief or comfort. In this setting, ghrelin can contribute to a pattern where hunger feels less tied to energy needs and more tied to emotional state and environmental cues. There is also an interesting relationship between ghrelin and the type of food you find appealing. When ghrelin is elevated, the brain becomes more responsive to foods that are high in energy, particularly those that are rich in sugar or fat. This is not accidental. From a biological perspective, when the body is preparing to eat, it makes sense to favour foods that provide more energy with less effort. In environments where food was scarce, this would have been highly advantageous. In modern environments where such foods are abundant and easily accessible, it can make appetite feel more difficult to manage. This is one reason why hunger can shift from general to specific. At first, you may simply feel that you could eat. Then, as ghrelin continues to act and the brain's reward systems engage, certain foods begin to stand out more than others. A simple meal may seem less appealing than something more rewarding. The body signal has been shaped by the brain's preferences, and together they create a stronger pull. Another important aspect of ghrelin is that it does not disappear immediately after eating. Its levels fall after a meal, but the timing and extent of that decrease depend on what and how you eat. Meals that are higher in protein, fibre and volume tend to suppress ghrelin more effectively and for longer periods. Meals that are quickly digested or low in these components may lead to a shorter reduction, allowing hunger to return sooner. This is one of the reasons why some meals feel satisfying for hours, while others seem to fade quickly, leaving you wondering why you are thinking about food again so soon. It also explains why eating does not always feel like it solves hunger in a straightforward way. If ghrelin remains relatively elevated or rises again quickly, the sense of appetite can return even when the stomach is not completely empty. This can feel confusing, especially if you expect a meal to create a clear and lasting sense of fullness. The body is not simply responding to volume, it is responding to the overall hormonal and metabolic picture. There is also a longer-term dimension to ghrelin that becomes especially noticeable during dieting or sustained calorie restriction. When the body senses a reduction in energy intake over time, ghrelin levels can increase. This is part of a broader adaptive response designed to encourage eating and protect against energy shortage. It is not a sign that something is broken. It is the body responding in the way it has been shaped to respond over a very long history, where food availability was uncertain. For the person experiencing it, however, this can feel like a constant pressure. Hunger becomes more frequent, more persistent, and sometimes more intense. Food thoughts become harder to ignore. This is one of the reasons why long-term dieting can feel so challenging. It is not simply a matter of maintaining discipline. The body is actively increasing signals that encourage eating, and ghrelin is one of the key contributors to that process. At the same time, ghrelin is not the only voice in the system. It is one part of a larger conversation, and its influence depends on how it interacts with other signals. Leptin, for example, provides information about longer-term energy stores, and the balance between these signals helps shape overall appetite. If leptin signaling is reduced or less effective, the brain may become more sensitive to ghrelin, making hunger feel stronger even when energy stores are sufficient. This is one of the ways in which different parts of the system can fall out of alignment. The brain's response to ghrelin is also influenced by experience and environment. If certain foods are strongly associated with reward, comfort, or habit, the presence of ghrelin can make those associations more powerful. This is why hunger can feel different depending on what is available. A simple, neutral environment may allow hunger to remain mild and manageable. A food-rich environment filled with cues and options can amplify the same underlying signal into something much harder to ignore. There is a subtle but important point here. Ghrelin does not force you to eat. It changes how food feels to you. It alters the landscape of attention and motivation. It makes eating seem more relevant, more appealing, more immediate. The decision to eat still exists, but it is being shaped by a signal that is designed to make that decision easier to make in one particular direction. This shaping effect is why hunger can feel so persuasive. It is not just a thought, it is a state. It influences how you interpret the environment, how you value food, and how much effort you are willing to invest in obtaining it. When ghrelin is low, food can seem distant, optional, even uninteresting. When ghrelin is high, food can seem close, important, and difficult to ignore. The world has not changed, but your perception of it has. It is also worth noticing that ghrelin follows patterns over time, not just within a single day. If eating habits change consistently, ghrelin patterns can adjust. This does not happen instantly, and it is not always smooth, but the system is capable of adapting. Regular meal timing, consistent sleep, and stable routines can help create more predictable patterns of hunger. Irregular eating, frequent snacking, and disrupted sleep can make those patterns less stable, leading to hunger that feels less predictable and more intrusive. This adaptability is both reassuring and challenging. It means the system is not fixed, but it also means that short-term changes may not immediately produce the desired effect. The body learns over time, and it often requires repeated experience to adjust its signals. This is why hunger can feel particularly strong when routines change, whether that change involves eating less, eating at different times, or shifting the composition of meals. The body's recalibrating, and ghrelin is part of that process. Another layer to consider is how quickly ghrelin can respond to cues that are not strictly about energy. Seeing food, thinking about food, or even anticipating a meal can influence appetite in ways that interact with ghrelin's effects. The boundary between physiological hunger and learned expectation is not sharp. The body integrates both, producing a signal that feels unified even though it has multiple sources. This is one reason why managing hunger is not only about the body's internal state but also about the environment. Reducing constant exposure to highly stimulating food cues can make hunger feel quieter and more manageable. Creating consistent meal patterns can help ghrelin follow a more predictable rhythm. Improving sleep can reduce unnecessary amplification of appetite signals. None of these changes remove ghrelin from the system, but they can influence how strongly it shapes the experience of hunger. At its core, ghrelin is not an enemy. It is a messenger, one that has been part of human biology for a very long time. It helps ensure that eating happens regularly enough to support life. It helps align behavior with energy needs, even if it sometimes overshoots or becomes difficult to manage in modern conditions. Understanding it does not make hunger disappear, but it does make hunger more understandable. When you feel that familiar rise of appetite, the growing sense that food is becoming more relevant, more interesting, more necessary, you're experiencing the combined effect of many signals, and ghrelin is likely one of the earliest to speak. It begins the conversation, sets the tone, and invites the brain to pay attention. What happens next depends on the rest of the system, on the environment, and on the choices that follow, and this is where another voice enters, one that is meant to balance that rising signal, to tell the brain not just when to begin eating, but when to feel that enough has been reached. There is a moment that people expect to arrive during a meal, a quiet shift somewhere between the first few bites and the last, when the body is meant to signal that enough has been reached. Not stuffed, not uncomfortable, just complete. A sense that eating can slow down, that the need has been met, that continuing is optional rather than necessary. Most people assume this signal is simple, almost automatic, as if the body keeps a careful count and flips a switch at the right time. But that moment is not controlled by a single switch. It is the result of several systems working together, and one of the most important voices in that process is a hormone called leptin. Leptin is often described as the body's fullness signal, but that description can be misleading if taken too literally. It does not function like a short-term message that appears during a meal and tells you to stop eating right away. Instead, leptin operates on a broader scale. It reflects the amount of energy stored in the body over time, particularly in fat tissue, and communicates that information to the brain. It is less like a sentence spoken at the dinner table and more like a background understanding that shapes how the brain responds to food in general. Most of leptin is produced by fat cells. As the amount of stored energy in the body increases, leptin levels tend to rise. As stored energy decreases, leptin levels fall. This makes leptin a kind of long-term indicator, a way for the body to keep track of its reserves. The brain, particularly areas involved in energy balance, receives this information and uses it to adjust appetite, metabolism, and behavior. When leptin is functioning as expected, higher levels should reduce appetite and make it easier to feel satisfied, while lower levels should increase hunger and encourage eating. This arrangement makes sense when viewed from the perspective of survival. If the body has plenty of stored energy, it can afford to be less urgent about food. If stores are low, the system should push more strongly toward eating. Leptin helps create that balance. It informs the brain about the broader energy situation, allowing short-term signals like stomach fullness and ghrelin to be interpreted in context. Without leptin, the brain would have a harder time understanding whether a current meal is enough relative to the body's overall needs. But the experience of fullness during a meal does not come from leptin alone. That immediate sense of being satisfied involves signals from the stomach stretching, nutrients entering the bloodstream, hormones released from the gut, and feedback from the brain. Leptin's role is quieter and slower. It shapes how strongly those immediate signals are felt and how the brain responds to them. When leptin signaling is effective, the body is more likely to register fullness appropriately and reduce interest in continued eating. When leptin signaling is impaired, that same meal may not produce the expected sense of completion. This is where things begin to feel confusing for many people. If leptin levels increase with more stored energy, then in theory, individuals with higher body fat should have stronger signals to stop eating. But in practice, this is often not what happens. Many people experience persistent hunger or difficulty feeling satisfied despite having elevated leptin levels. This condition is often described as leptin resistance, though the term itself can oversimplify what is actually a complex interaction of signaling pathways. Leptin resistance does not mean leptin is absent. It means the signal is not being effectively received or interpreted by the brain. The hormone is present, sometimes in high amounts, but the brain behaves as if the message is faint or unreliable. It is similar to a situation where someone is speaking clearly, but the listener is distracted, overwhelmed, or no longer responding in the same way. The communication exists, but its impact is reduced. When this happens, the balance between hunger and fullness shifts. The brain may continue to promote eating even when energy stores are sufficient. Meals may feel less satisfying. The natural pause that should occur after eating may be weaker or delayed. Hunger may return sooner than expected. This is not because the body lacks the information about its energy stores, but because the interpretation of that information has changed. Several factors can contribute to this reduced sensitivity to leptin. One of the most significant is chronic overexposure to energy, particularly in forms that are highly processed and easy to consume in large amounts. Over time, the system that responds to leptin may become less responsive, much like how constant exposure to any signal can reduce sensitivity. Inflammation, particularly in certain brain regions, has also been linked to disruptions in leptin signaling. The details of these processes are still being studied, but the overall pattern is clear enough to explain why fullness does not always feel as straightforward as it should. Sleep also plays a role in this system. When sleep is reduced or disrupted, leptin levels can decrease, while hunger-promoting signals increase. This creates a situation where the body feels less satisfied and more inclined to seek food, even when energy needs have not changed significantly. Many people notice that after a poor night of sleep, appetite feels different, more persistent, less easily quieted by a meal. This is not a coincidence. The hormonal environment has shifted, and leptin is part of that shift. Stress can influence leptin as well, though again not in a simple, single-direction way. Chronic stress can alter how the body regulates appetite, often increasing the appeal of energy-dense foods and disrupting the balance between hunger and fullness signals. The brain under stress is not only concerned with energy, it is also responding to emotional and physiological demands, and food can become part of that response. In this context, leptin's voice may be present but less persuasive. Another important aspect of leptin is how it interacts with the brain's reward system. Fullness is not only about the physical state of the stomach or the presence of nutrients, it is also about satisfaction, the sense that eating has been enough not just physically but mentally. When highly rewarding foods are involved, the drive to continue eating can extend beyond what leptin and other satiety signals are trying to communicate. The brain may continue to seek the rewarding experience even after the body's energy needs have been met. This is one reason why fullness can feel incomplete even after a large meal. The stomach may be full, nutrients may be circulating, and leptin may be signaling that energy stores are sufficient. But if the meal did not match the brain's expectations, or if highly rewarding foods are still available, the desire to eat can persist. The system is not malfunctioning in a simple sense, it is integrating multiple signals, and the outcome reflects that complexity. It is also important to recognise that leptin operates over longer timeframes. Changes in body composition, sustained changes in eating patterns, and shifts in energy balance can influence leptin levels and sensitivity, but these changes do not occur instantly. The body adjusts gradually. This means that short-term efforts to control appetite may not immediately align with how leptin is influencing the system. The brain is working with a longer-term picture, and it may continue to behave according to that picture even when immediate behaviour changes. This longer-term perspective is especially noticeable during weight loss. As body fat decreases, leptin levels tend to fall. From the body's point of view, this signals a reduction in stored energy, and the response is often an increase in hunger and a decrease in energy expenditure. This is part of the body's attempt to maintain balance. It is not an error. It is a protective mechanism. However, for the individual, it can feel like a persistent resistance, a sense that hunger is stronger than expected and fullness harder to achieve. This is one of the reasons why maintaining changes in body weight can be challenging. The body is not neutral about losing stored energy. It responds by adjusting signals in ways that encourage a return to previous levels. Leptin is central to this process. As its levels drop, the brain becomes more attentive to hunger signals and less easily satisfied by food. The same meal that once felt adequate may no longer produce the same sense of completion. At the same time, the system is not entirely fixed. Leptin sensitivity can improve under certain conditions, particularly when overall health, sleep and dietary patterns support more stable regulation. This does not mean there is a simple switch to restore perfect balance, but it does mean the system can shift. The body is capable of adapting, though it often requires consistency over time rather than quick changes. Another subtle but important point is that fullness is not a single sensation. It is a combination of signals that arrive at different times. The stomach may begin to stretch as food enters, sending early signals of fullness. Nutrients absorbed into the bloodstream trigger additional responses. Hormones released from the gut contribute to the process. Leptin provides a longer-term context. The brain integrates all of these signals, and the final experience is what we call being full. If any part of this process is out of sync, fullness can feel incomplete or delayed. Eating quickly can outpace the arrival of satiety signals, leading to continued intake before the brain has registered enough information. Meals low in certain nutrients may not trigger strong satiety responses. Distractions can reduce awareness of fullness, and if leptin signaling is less effective, the overall sense of satisfaction may be reduced even when the physical components are present. This helps explain why slowing down during meals can make a difference. It allows time for signals to develop and reach the brain. It gives the system a chance to catch up with behaviour. The goal is not to force a particular outcome, but to create conditions where the body's signals can be recognised more clearly. When eating happens too quickly or in a highly distracted state, the conversation between body and brain becomes harder to hear. It also explains why the same amount of food can feel different on different days. Fullness is not determined solely by quantity. It depends on hormonal state, sleep, stress, previous intake, and the composition of the meal. Leptin is part of that background, shaping how the brain interprets everything else. The result is a system that is consistent in its purpose but variable in its expression. When people say they do not feel full, they're often describing a mismatch between expectation and experience. They expect a clear, reliable signal that tells them when to stop. But the system is more complex than that. It is not failing. It is operating under multiple influences, and sometimes those influences do not align in a way that produces a simple answer. Understanding leptin helps reframe that experience. It shows that fullness is not just about the last few bites of a meal, but about the body's broader sense of energy balance. It explains why appetite can remain strong even when food has been consumed, and why changes in sleep, stress, and routine can alter how satisfying food feels. It shifts the focus from willpower to biology, from judgment to curiosity. Leptin does not command you to stop eating in a clear, audible voice. It contributes to a background state that makes stopping feel appropriate. When that background is stable, eating and stopping can feel natural and unforced. When it is disrupted, the same process can feel uncertain and difficult. The difference is not a matter of discipline. It is a matter of how signals are being sent and received. This is where the conversation between leptin and ghrelin becomes especially important. Ghrelin encourages eating, raising the sense that food is needed or desirable. Leptin provides context, indicating whether energy stores are sufficient. In a balanced system, these signals work together, guiding behaviour in a way that supports both immediate needs and long-term stability. When they fall out of balance, hunger and fullness can feel disconnected from what we expect, and that imbalance does not happen in isolation. It reflects the combined influence of environment, behaviour, physiology, and time, all of which shape how these signals are produced and interpreted. One of the strangest things about appetite is that the body can sound deeply confident while also being completely mixed up. Hunger says eat. Fullness says perhaps that was enough. Reward says keep going anyway. Habit says this is the hour for something sweet. Stress says comfort would be useful. Fatigue says quick energy, please. The stomach says there is still room. The brain says there might not be another chance, even though the refrigerator is 3 meters away and behaving with its usual reliability. When these signals line up, eating feels almost effortless. You get hungry, you eat, you settle, and the matter more or less closes itself. But when the signals stop agreeing, appetite becomes confusing in a way that can feel personal, almost accusatory, as if the body has suddenly become unreasonable. This is the point where many people begin blaming themselves. They assume the problem is a lack of discipline, a weak character, or some private defect in motivation. Yet from a biological point of view, disagreement in appetite signals is not especially mysterious. The systems involved in hunger and fullness were never designed to function in perfect isolation from the rest of life. They are influenced by sleep, stress, food quality, meal timing, body fat, movement, reward, routine, memory, hormones, inflammation, and simple exposure to tempting food. The wonder is not that the conversation sometimes goes wrong. The wonder is that it works as well as it does most of the time. When we talk about hunger signals disagreeing, what we really mean is that different parts of the system are sending messages based on different priorities. Ghrelin may be rising and encouraging eating. Leptin may be present but not being heard clearly. The stomach may still be relatively full, but the brain may be understimulated, tired, or focused on reward. A meal may have delivered plenty of calories, but not much lasting satiety. A person may not need more energy in the strict sense, yet still feel compelled to keep eating because the body and brain are not asking the same question. One is asking, do we have enough stored? Another is asking, will this feel good right now? Another is asking, are we safe if food becomes scarce later? Another is asking, can we please have something crunchy and salty because today has been ridiculous? The result of all this is that appetite can stop feeling like a clear bodily need and start feeling like a noisy committee meeting in which no one has agreed on the agenda. A useful way to think about the system is to imagine that hunger and fullness are not opposites on a single line, but overlapping processes that can rise and fall independently. People often assume that as hunger rises, fullness falls, and as fullness rises, hunger disappears. In reality, these processes can coexist. You can feel physically full and still want to eat. You can feel low appetite and still not be truly satisfied. You can stop being hungry without feeling finished. That last one is especially important. Many eating problems, whether they involve overeating, constant snacking, or the feeling of never quite arriving at enough, live in the gap between fullness and satisfaction. This gap opens wider when hunger signals become uncoordinated. A person may eat enough to stretch the stomach, and yet not receive the kind of hormonal or psychological closure that helps the brain settle. The meal may be too low in protein, too quickly digested, or built in a way that produces only a short-lived drop in appetite. Or the meal may be perfectly adequate on paper, but eaten while distracted, rushed, or emotionally frayed, so the brain never fully registers completion. In these moments, the body has technically been fed, but the experience of being done has not arrived. The system has input, but not resolution. One common example is the meal that looks generous but leaves someone prowling around the kitchen an hour later. This often happens when food delivers quick energy without much staying power. A breakfast of refined carbohydrates and very little protein or fibre may create a brief sense of satisfaction and then disappear from the appetite system faster than expected. The stomach empties relatively quickly. Blood sugar and insulin dynamics shift. Ghrelin begins to return, and the person who assumed they had eaten a decent meal now feels as though something has gone wrong. In truth, the signals were never aligned very well to begin with. The meal calmed immediate hunger, but it did not produce strong, lasting agreement among the systems that regulate appetite. Another example is stress eating, though that phrase can be a little too casual for what is often a complicated biological situation. Under chronic stress, the body is not merely using food emotionally, in some vague or trivial sense. Stress changes hormones, sleep quality, reward sensitivity, and impulse control. It can make the brain more interested in relief and less interested in patience. It can increase attention to highly palatable foods and make ordinary satiety signals feel less convincing. In that state, hunger and fullness stop being a simple question of calories. Food begins to participate in mood regulation, and appetite becomes entangled with the search for comfort. This is why a stressed person can eat a meal, remain physically full, and still feel drawn toward dessert or snacks. The body's energy needs may have been met, but the brain's broader needs have not been settled. The signals disagree because they are not talking about the same thing. The stomach is speaking mechanically, reward circuits are speaking emotionally, habit is speaking behaviorally, stress is speaking urgently, and the conscious mind, caught in the middle, often interprets this conflict as a personal failure rather than a biological mismatch. Sleep loss creates a similar kind of disagreement, though with its own flavour. After poor sleep, ghrelin often rises, leptin signalling may weaken, and the brain becomes more reactive to food cues. At the same time, decision-making tends to be less steady, reward-seeking stronger, and patience thinner. So the body becomes both more interested in food and less responsive to the signals that should help regulate intake. This is an almost perfect recipe for appetite confusion. People often say that after bad sleep they feel hungry all day, or that nothing quite hits the spot, or that they want snacks even after meals. That is not imaginary. It is the body's internal conversation becoming harder to coordinate under conditions of fatigue. Timing matters too. Irregular meal patterns can create a situation where the body keeps trying to predict food and keeps being wrong. When meals happen at very different times from day to day, ghrelin may still rise in anticipation of usual eating windows, while the rest of the system receives inconsistent input. Some people tolerate this easily, but others find that irregular timing makes appetite feel intrusive, jumpy, or strangely disconnected from actual need. They may not feel particularly hungry during the day when they are busy, then suddenly become overwhelmingly hungry in the evening when attention returns and delayed signals rush in at once. Again, the problem is not that hunger exists. The problem is that the system has lost its rhythm. This loss of rhythm is one of the quiet signatures of modern eating life. Food is available constantly. Many people work through meals, snack while distracted, skip proper meals, then overcorrect later. Hunger no longer rises against a clear background. It emerges into a day full of random cues, stress, fatigue, and opportunity. The body tries to keep up, but the conversation becomes fragmented. Some signals are tied to actual energy need, others are tied to routine, others are tied to emotional state, others are tied to visibility and convenience. By evening, it can feel as if the body has spent the whole day composing a message and only managed to deliver it all at once. There is also the matter of leptin resistance, which we touched on earlier, and which belongs centrally in this discussion of disagreement. In theory, leptin should help the brain understand that enough energy is stored and that urgent food seeking can soften. But when leptin signaling becomes less effective, the brain behaves as though stored energy is less secure than it actually is. This shifts the whole conversation toward preservation. Hunger becomes more persuasive, fullness becomes less authoritative. The body is not being irrational in its own terms. It is working from distorted information, which is rather like trying to manage a household budget while someone has quietly replaced your account balance with the wrong number. Once that happens, other signals that might otherwise be manageable can become much more difficult. Ghrelin rises and is taken seriously. Reward cues appear more attractive. Restriction feels harder to sustain. Normal appetite becomes louder, and highly palatable foods become especially hard to ignore. The disagreement is not merely between hunger and fullness now. It is between the body's actual reserves and the brain's perception of those reserves. That is a much deeper mismatch, and it helps explain why some people can feel unexpectedly driven to eat, even when outside observers assume they shouldn't be hungry. The trouble with outside observations, of course, is that they usually confuse body size with appetite experience. A person may have sufficient or abundant energy stores and still experience frequent, real, biologically persuasive hunger. The presence of stored energy does not guarantee that the brain is hearing leptin's message clearly, nor does it guarantee that reward, stress, habit, and sleep are not overwhelming the system. Appetite is not a moral lesson delivered by body shape. It is a live conversation between many overlapping signals, and those signals can become badly misaligned. Reward deserves special attention here because it is one of the most reliable ways the conversation gets pulled off course. Humans are wired to enjoy food, especially calorie-dense food. That enjoyment is not a flaw. It helps make eating happen. But modern foods are often engineered to be extremely rewarding. Soft, salty, sweet, fatty, crunchy, convenient and easy to consume past the point where traditional satiety signals would normally slow us down. This means reward can outrun fullness. The brain continues saying yes while the body's quieter signals are still trying to catch up. Think of the difference between a plain meal and a highly processed snack. Both may provide energy, but they do not occupy the same territory in the reward system. Snacks designed for maximum palatability can keep interest alive well beyond early fullness, because they are not just answering hunger, they are stimulating wanting. This is another place where people often judge themselves unfairly. They assume that if they were better at self-control, they would feel no extra pull. But biology says otherwise. Reward systems are meant to respond. The question is not why they respond, but how strongly, how often, and under what conditions. Restriction can make all of this worse, especially when it is rigid, prolonged, or mixed with a lot of fear. When people repeatedly ignore hunger, cut intake sharply, or divide foods into saintly and sinful categories, the body and brain tend to become more alert around food, not less. Ghrelin may rise. Thoughts about food may become more persistent. Reward may intensify. Eating can begin to feel chaotic, not because the person lacks discipline, but because the system has been pushed into a more defensive state. Hunger and fullness stop behaving like cooperative guides and start behaving like opposing legal teams arguing in different rooms. This is one reason why dieting often produces a peculiar sequence. At first, there may be a sense of control, even clarity. Meals are planned, rules are followed, hunger is tolerated. But over time, the body adjusts. Hunger cues intensify, satiety weakens, cravings sharpen, food becomes mentally louder. Then one evening, the person eats more than intended and feels as though discipline has collapsed from nowhere. Yet from a biological perspective, very little happened from nowhere. The conversation had been moving out of balance for some time. The final overeating episode was not the beginning of the problem. It was the visible result of a system under mounting pressure. Emotional learning adds another layer. If food is repeatedly served as comfort, celebration, relief, company, distraction, or reward, then appetite signals can begin borrowing those pathways. A difficult day may create a feeling that resembles hunger or merges with it. Loneliness may draw attention toward familiar foods. A quiet evening may awaken habitual snacking simply because the brain has learned that this is when eating happens and feels good. These patterns are not fake, they are learned. And once learned, they become part of the larger appetite conversation, contributing to the sense that signals are saying contradictory things at once. The body also reacts differently to different macronutrients, and this can produce its own kind of disagreement. Protein tends to be strongly satiating for many people. Fibre and food volume help too. Fat slows gastric emptying and contributes to satisfaction, though its effects vary depending on context and food form. Refined carbohydrates can provide quick energy, but may not always produce lasting satiety, especially when eaten alone or in highly processed forms. So 2 meals with similar calories can create very different conversations afterward. One may produce steadiness and closure. Another may produce an early return of appetite and a strange sense that eating happened but did not quite count. That feeling of it didn't count is more important than it sounds. It is often the first sign that the signals are out of agreement. The stomach received food, the body got energy, yet the brain still feels unconvinced. People tend to respond to this with self-criticism, but a better response is curiosity. Was the meal satisfying in texture, taste, and composition? Was it eaten too quickly? Was there enough protein, enough volume, enough pause afterward for the body to catch up? Was the person already sleep-deprived, stressed, or underfed from earlier? Asking these questions is not an excuse. It is a way of understanding the system instead of insulting it. There is also a temporal lag built into satiety that people often underestimate. hunger can rise quickly and convincingly, especially when ghrelin, routine, and reward are aligned. Fullness, by contrast, is often slower. Stretch signals from the stomach begin early, but deeper satiety signals from digestion and hormones take time to develop. If someone eats very quickly or in a state of strong hunger, it is easy to outrun fullness before it has had a chance to arrive. Then, 20 minutes later, there is discomfort and confusion. Again, the problem is not moral weakness. It is a timing issue inside a system built from layered signals rather than instantaneous switches. Physical activity can influence this conversation too, though not always predictably. Some people find movement reduces appetite for a time, especially intense exercise. Others find it increases hunger later in the day. Regular movement can improve insulin sensitivity, mood, sleep, and appetite regulation overall. But any single bout of exercise interacts with the rest of the system in a context-dependent way. The important point is that movement is part of the appetite conversation, not separate from it. The body is always integrating. Inflammation and metabolic health matter in the background as well. When insulin signaling, leptin signaling, stress hormones, and inflammatory pathways are all under strain, appetite regulation can become less precise. The body is still trying to defend itself, but the signals do not arrive with their former clarity. People often describe this as feeling always hungry or never full, and while those phrases are subjective, they often reflect real dysregulation. The body's guidance system has become noisier. Even the social world plays a role. We eat differently with other people. Meals stretch longer, portions change, attention shifts, reward deepens, and norms influence behaviour. None of this is inherently bad. Shared eating is human and often wonderful. But it does mean appetite is not solely private biology. It is social behaviour shaped by context. A person may feel perfectly regulated alone and then overeat easily in company, not because the body suddenly forgot what enough means, but because reward, pace, and cues changed. What all of this adds up to is a very important idea. When hunger signals stop agreeing, the answer is rarely to shout louder at yourself. Harshness does not restore coordination. The system usually responds better to steadiness than punishment. Predictable meals, enough sleep, less chaotic restriction, more balanced meal composition, reduced constant food cues where possible, slower eating, and a bit of honest curiosity about patterns can all help the body's signals begin speaking in a more coherent way again. Not perfectly, not instantly, but more coherently. The goal is not to become someone who never feels hunger, never wants dessert, never eats from emotion, and never misreads appetite. That would be less like being human and more like being a very stern appliance. The goal is to understand when the body's messages are aligned and when they are being distorted by fatigue, stress, reward, habit, or a longer-term mismatch in signalling. Once you can see those patterns, appetite becomes less of a moral mystery and more of a biological landscape. And this is where the brain itself becomes impossible to ignore, because however loudly the stomach, fat tissue, and hormones may speak, it is the brain that receives, translates, prioritizes, and turns those messages into the lived experience of hunger or enough. If all the signals of hunger and fullness are like messages being sent from different parts of the body, then the brain is the place where those messages are read, compared, and turned into something you can actually feel. It is not enough for the stomach to stretch, for hormones to rise or fall, or for nutrients to enter the bloodstream. None of those things become hunger or fullness until the brain interprets them. And at the centre of that interpretation, quietly working all the time without asking for attention, is a small but extremely important structure called the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is not large. It sits deep within the brain, tucked beneath the thalamus, and yet it plays a central role in maintaining balance across many systems. Temperature, thirst, sleep, hormones, and energy regulation all pass through its influence. When it comes to appetite, the hypothalamus acts less like a simple switchboard and more like a decision maker that weighs incoming information and adjusts behaviour accordingly. It is constantly receiving signals from the body and constantly sending instructions back out, shaping how hungry you feel, how motivated you are to eat, and how satisfied you become after a meal. To understand how this works, it helps to think of the hypothalamus as a place where different types of information meet. Signals from the stomach arrive through nerves, reporting stretch and activity. Hormones like ghrelin and leptin circulate through the bloodstream and reach the brain, carrying information about short-term hunger and long-term energy stores. Nutrients in the blood provide another layer of data, reflecting what has been absorbed and what is currently available for use. All of this arrives together, not as a single clear message, but as a collection of inputs that need to be interpreted. Within the hypothalamus, there are groups of neurons that respond to these signals in different ways. Some neurons promote eating, others suppress it. The balance between these groups determines the overall direction of appetite at any given moment. When hunger-promoting neurons are more active, food becomes more appealing, more necessary, harder to ignore. When satiety-promoting neurons are more active, the opposite happens. Food becomes less urgent, less interesting, easier to leave alone. This balance is not fixed. It shifts continuously, influenced by everything the body is experiencing. Ghrelin tends to activate hunger-promoting pathways, increasing the drive to eat. Leptin and other satiety signals work in the opposite direction, encouraging the brain to reduce intake when energy stores are sufficient. The hypothalamus integrates these influences, not in isolation, but alongside signals related to stress, reward, and environment. This is where the system becomes more complex than a simple energy calculation. The hypothalamus is not working alone. It is connected to other parts of the brain that influence behaviour, emotion, and motivation. The limbic system, which is involved in emotion and reward, plays a role in how appealing food feels. The prefrontal cortex, associated with planning and decision-making, contributes to self-control and long-term thinking. Together, these regions create the experience of appetite as something that is both physical and psychological. This means that when the hypothalamus decides whether you feel hungry or full, it is not making a purely biological judgment. It is part of a network that includes memory, expectation, and reward. A meal that is physically sufficient may still leave the brain unsatisfied if it does not match what the reward system is expecting. A stressful situation may increase appetite even when energy levels are stable. A familiar routine may trigger hunger simply because it has always done so. The hypothalamus receives the signals, but the meaning of those signals is shaped by the wider brain. One of the most important aspects of this system is that it is designed to prioritize survival. From the brain's point of view, running low on energy is a risk that needs to be avoided. As a result, hunger signals often carry more urgency than fullness signals. The system is biased toward encouraging eating when there is uncertainty, rather than allowing energy levels to drop too far. This bias is subtle, but becomes more noticeable when signals are out of balance. Hunger may feel stronger and more persistent, while fullness may feel weaker or slower to arrive. This bias also helps explain why it can be easier to start eating than to stop. The signals that initiate eating are often clear and persuasive. The signals that end it are more gradual, requiring time and attention to be fully recognized. If eating happens quickly or in a distracted state, the brain may not fully register the incoming satiety signals before more food has already been consumed. The hypothalamus is still processing information, but the behavior has moved ahead of the interpretation. Another important feature of the hypothalamus is that it adapts based on experience. It is not a fixed system that responds the same way under all conditions. Repeated patterns of eating, fasting, stress, and sleep all influence how it interprets signals. For example, if the body experiences consistent calorie restriction, the hypothalamus may adjust by increasing hunger signals and reducing energy expenditure. This is part of the body's effort to maintain balance. It is not a mistake. It is an adaptive response to perceived scarcity. On the other hand, if the system is exposed to frequent high-calorie intake, particularly from highly rewarding foods, the hypothalamus may become less sensitive to certain satiety signals, including leptin. This can make it harder for the brain to recognize when enough has been reached, even when energy stores are high. The system is still functioning, but its calibration has shifted. It is responding to a different set of inputs and expectations. This adaptability is both helpful and challenging. It allows the body to respond to changing conditions, but it also means that short-term changes in behavior do not always produce immediate changes in appetite. The hypothalamus is working with a broader history, not just the present moment. It takes time for patterns to be learned and unlearned, for sensitivity to adjust, and for signals to regain clarity. Sleep has a particularly strong influence on this process. When sleep is disrupted, the hypothalamus receives signals that alter the balance between hunger and fullness. Ghrelin levels may increase, leptin signaling may decrease, and the brain becomes more responsive to food cues. At the same time, the prefrontal cortex, which helps regulate behavior, may be less effective. This creates a situation where the drive to eat is stronger and the ability to resist is weaker. The hypothalamus is still interpreting signals, but the context in which it operates has changed. Stress affects the system in a similar way. Chronic stress can alter hormonal signals, increase the appeal of certain foods, and disrupt the balance between different brain regions involved in appetite. The hypothalamus is closely linked to the body's stress response, and when that response is activated frequently, it can influence how hunger and fullness are perceived. Food may become more than fuel. It may become part of the body's attempt to manage stress, even if that strategy is not always effective in the long term. The environment also plays a role in how the hypothalamus interprets signals. Constant exposure to food cues can keep the system in a state of readiness, making it more likely that hunger will be noticed and acted upon. Highly palatable foods can amplify reward signals, making them more difficult to ignore even when satiety signals are present. The hypothalamus does not operate in a vacuum. It is influenced by what you see, smell, and experience throughout the day. One of the more subtle aspects of this system is how it distinguishes between different types of hunger. Physical hunger, driven by energy needs, tends to build gradually and can be satisfied by a range of foods. It is flexible. Psychological or reward-driven hunger can feel more specific, more urgent, and more focused on particular foods. The hypothalamus interacts with both types, but the balance between them depends on the broader context. This is why paying attention to the quality of hunger can be helpful, not as a strict rule, but as a way of understanding what the body is asking for. A gentle, growing hunger may reflect a normal need for energy. A sudden, intense craving for a specific food may involve more input from reward pathways. Both are real, but they are not identical, and they may benefit from different responses. The hypothalamus does not label these experiences for you. It provides the underlying signals, but the interpretation happens at the level of awareness. Learning to notice patterns, to recognize when hunger is steady and when it is reactive, can make the system easier to work with. It does not eliminate appetite, but it adds a layer of understanding that can reduce confusion. Another important point is that the hypothalamus is not perfect. It is highly effective, but it is not immune to disruption. Modern conditions can challenge its ability to maintain balance. Constant food availability, irregular schedules, poor sleep, chronic stress, and highly processed foods all create inputs that the system did not evolve to handle in their current form. The hypothalamus adapts, but that adaptation can lead to signals that feel less clear or less reliable. This does not mean the system is broken. It means it is responding to a complex environment. The signals you feel are real, but they may reflect a mixture of influences that are not always aligned. Understanding this can shift the way you think about appetite. Instead of seeing it as something to control or suppress, it becomes something to interpret, to work with, to understand in context. When hunger and fullness feel confusing, it is often because the hypothalamus is receiving mixed messages. Hormones, nutrients, sleep, stress, and environment are all contributing, and the result is a signal that does not fit neatly into a single category. The experience may feel inconsistent, but the underlying process is still following patterns, still trying to maintain balance, and this brings us to an important realization. Even when the brain is listening carefully, even when the hypothalamus is doing its best to interpret signals, the final experience of hunger can still feel stronger than expected. You may eat, you may feel physically full, and yet the desire to continue can remain. Not because the brain has failed, but because other systems, especially those related to reward and habit, are still influencing the outcome. There is a particular kind of confusion that tends to appear after a meal when, by all reasonable measures, eating should be finished. The plate is empty. The stomach feels full, sometimes even slightly overfull. And yet, instead of that quiet sense of completion people expect, there is still a pull toward food. Not always overwhelming, not always urgent, but persistent enough to be noticed. A thought returns. Something more would be nice. Maybe something sweet, maybe something crunchy, maybe just a little extra. It can feel as though the body has ignored its own signals, as if fullness has somehow failed to do its job. This is one of the most common experiences in appetite, and also one of the most misunderstood. The assumption is usually that hunger should disappear once enough food has been eaten. When it does not, the conclusion is often that something is wrong, either with the body or with personal control. In reality, this situation is not a breakdown of the system. It is a reflection of how many different systems are involved, and how those systems do not always speak at the same time, or with the same priorities. To begin with, it helps to separate two ideas that often get mixed together: fullness and satisfaction. Fullness is largely physical. It involves the stomach stretching, food being present in the digestive system, and signals from the gut indicating that intake has occurred. Satisfaction is broader. It includes taste, expectation, reward, and a sense of completion that is partly psychological. A person can be physically full but not satisfied. When that happens, the desire to eat can continue even though the body has received enough energy. This difference becomes very clear in certain everyday situations. Imagine eating a meal that is filling but not particularly enjoyable. The stomach may be comfortably full, but the mind may still feel as though something is missing. That missing piece can drive continued eating, not because the body needs more fuel, but because the experience has not reached a sense of closure. On the other hand, a meal that is both filling and satisfying tends to quiet appetite more effectively, even if the total amount of food is similar. The brain plays a central role in this process, particularly areas involved in reward and motivation. When you eat, the brain is not only tracking nutrients, it is also evaluating how rewarding the experience is. If the reward matches or exceeds expectation, the system is more likely to settle. If it falls short, the brain may continue to seek additional input, even in the presence of fullness signals. This is why certain foods seem to complete a meal in a way that others do not. It is not only about calories, it is about how the brain interprets the experience. There is also a timing issue involved. Satiety signals do not all arrive at once. Some begin during the meal, such as the stretching of the stomach. Others develop as digestion progresses and nutrients are absorbed. Hormones released from the gut take time to influence the brain. Leptin operates on an even longer time scale, reflecting overall energy stores rather than immediate intake. This means that the sense of being fully satisfied can lag behind the act of eating. If eating happens quickly, or if attention is elsewhere, it is easy to reach the end of a meal before the full set of satiety signals has been processed. At that moment, the body may be on its way to feeling satisfied, but the brain has not yet caught up. This gap can create a window where additional eating feels appealing, even though the necessary signals are already in motion. Given a little time, the feeling of fullness may become clearer, but if more food is consumed during that window, the system can overshoot. distraction plays a significant role here. Eating while watching something, working, or scrolling through a phone can reduce awareness of both hunger and fullness. The body still receives food, but the brain's attention is divided. This can weaken the registration of satiety signals, making it harder to recognize when enough has been reached. Later, when attention returns, there may be a sense that eating did not quite count, even though it did in a physical sense. Another important factor is the composition of the meal itself. Not all foods produce the same satiety response. Meals that include adequate protein, fiber, and volume tend to create a stronger and more lasting sense of fullness. Foods that are highly processed, low in fiber, or quickly digested may provide energy but not sustain satiety for long. This can lead to a situation where hunger returns sooner than expected, or where the feeling of being done never fully arrives. For example, a meal that is mostly refined carbohydrates may be absorbed quickly, leading to a shorter duration of fullness. The stomach may empty faster, and hormonal signals related to satiety may decline sooner. In contrast, a meal with more protein and fiber tends to slow digestion, maintain fullness, and provide a more stable signal to the brain. The difference is not always obvious in the moment, but it becomes clear over time in how appetite behaves afterward. There is also the influence of highly palatable foods, which are designed to be especially appealing. These foods can activate reward pathways in the brain in a way that extends eating beyond physical need. The combination of taste, texture, and convenience can keep the brain engaged even after satiety signals have begun to develop. This is not a failure of the body. It is a reflection of how the reward system interacts with appetite. When these foods are present, the question the brain is answering is not only do we need more energy, but also, is this worth continuing? The answer can remain yes for longer than expected, particularly if the food is easy to eat and highly enjoyable. This is why it is possible to feel full and still continue eating certain foods, while feeling satisfied more quickly with others. Hormones also contribute to this experience in subtle ways. Ghrelin, which promotes hunger, may not drop immediately after eating, especially if the meal does not strongly suppress it. Leptin, which reflects longer-term energy stores, may not provide a clear signal in the short term, particularly if its signaling is reduced. Other hormones involved in satiety, such as those released from the gut, may vary depending on the type of food consumed. The result is a system where multiple signals are changing at different speeds, creating a temporary mismatch. Sleep and stress can amplify this mismatch. After poor sleep, appetite regulation often becomes less precise. Hunger signals may be stronger, and satiety signals less effective. This can make it easier to feel as though a meal was not enough, even when it was. Stress can have a similar effect, increasing the desire for food as a form of relief and reducing the clarity of fullness signals. In both cases, the body is not ignoring food intake. It is responding to a broader set of conditions. Habit is another powerful influence. If you're used to eating something after a meal, the brain may expect that pattern to continue. This expectation can feel like hunger, even when it is not driven by energy need. The body has learned that a certain sequence of events occurs, and it prepares for that sequence. Breaking the pattern can feel uncomfortable at first, not because the body requires more food, but because the expectation has not been met. This is why certain times of day can feel associated with hunger, even when meals have been adequate. The body is not only responding to current conditions, it is also responding to learned patterns. These patterns can be strong, and they can persist even when behavior changes. Over time, they can adjust, but they do not disappear immediately. Emotional state also plays a role in how hunger is experienced after a meal. Food is often linked to comfort, relaxation, or reward. When a meal is associated with these experiences, stopping can feel like interrupting something that is not only physical but emotional. The desire to continue eating may reflect a desire to extend that feeling rather than a need for more energy. This does not mean that eating in response to emotion is inherently wrong. It means that appetite is not purely biological. It is influenced by how food fits into the broader context of life. Recognizing this can help reduce confusion. The feeling of wanting more is not always a signal of need. It is often a signal of multiple systems interacting at once. Another subtle factor is the concept of sensory-specific satiety. As you eat a particular food, its appeal tends to decrease over time. This is part of what helps limit intake during a meal. However, if a new flavor or type of food is introduced, interest can increase again. This is why it is possible to feel full from one dish and still have room for dessert. The change in sensory experience creates a new form of interest, which can override existing fullness signals. This effect is not a flaw. It is part of how the brain encourages variety in diet. But in environments where multiple highly appealing foods are available, it can lead to extended eating beyond what would occur with a single, consistent meal. All of these factors contribute to the experience of eating without apparent need. The body is not failing to recognize fullness. It is integrating multiple signals, some of which are still encouraging intake. The result is a feeling that can seem contradictory, full, but still interested in food. Understanding this does not eliminate the experience, but it can change how it is interpreted. Instead of seeing it as a lack of control, it can be seen as a predictable outcome of how the system works. Fullness is one signal among many. It is important, but it is not the only one. One practical approach is to allow a brief pause after eating, giving time for satiety signals to develop fully. This does not need to be rigid or formal. It can simply be a moment of waiting, of letting the body catch up with the meal. Often, the desire for more will decrease as signals become clearer. Not always, but often enough to be useful. Another approach is to consider both fullness and satisfaction when planning meals. Including foods that are both physically filling and enjoyable can help align these signals more closely. This does not mean every meal must be perfect. It means recognizing that satisfaction is part of satiety, not separate from it. It is also helpful to notice patterns without judgment. When does the feeling of wanting more tend to appear? After certain types of meals, at certain times of day, under certain conditions of sleep or stress. These patterns are not random. They reflect how the system is responding, and they can provide useful information about how to support it more effectively. The goal is not to eliminate all desire for food after a meal. Appetite is dynamic, and occasional interest in eating is normal. The goal is to understand why that interest appears, and to recognize when it reflects a mismatch rather than a true need. And this mismatch becomes even more pronounced when the environment itself is constantly encouraging eating, when food is not only available, but designed to keep attention and interest alive long after the body has had enough. For most of human history, hunger had a very different job from the one it has now. It was meant to guide a body through an environment where food was uncertain, effort was often required, and eating opportunities were not constant. Hunger needed to be persuasive because missing chances to eat could carry real consequences. Fullness needed to be useful, but not so powerful that it made a person careless about the next opportunity. The whole system was built for a world in which food arrived in patterns of effort, season, scarcity, and interruption. Then, quite suddenly by evolutionary standards, that world changed. Now food is not only abundant in many places, it is designed, displayed, packaged, advertised, delivered, and made available in a way that presses on appetite systems almost continuously. The body's older signals are still trying to do their work, but they are doing it in an environment full of interruptions and exaggerations. This is where processed food, frequent snacking, and modern eating habits begin to create a very particular kind of confusion. Hunger stops feeling like a clear message from the body and starts feeling more like a signal jammed by outside noise. Processed food is not a single thing, of course. It is a broad category, and not all processing is harmful or even especially meaningful. Frozen vegetables are processed, Yogurt is processed, bread is processed. The real trouble tends to come with foods that are highly engineered for convenience, palatability, and repeated use. These foods are often soft, fast to chew, easy to swallow, quick to digest, and carefully balanced to hit combinations of salt, sugar, fat, and flavour that the brain finds difficult to ignore. They are not merely food in the old sense. They are products built to be appealing in a very reliable, repeatable way. That reliability matters more than people sometimes realise. A simple meal made from minimally altered foods usually asks more of the body and brain. It may require chewing, more time, more digestion, and more attention to sensory experience as satiety develops. Highly processed foods often do the opposite. They reduce friction. They make eating easy to begin, easy to continue, and easy to repeat. The body still receives calories, of course, but the usual satiety signals can become less effective when food is hyperpalatable and easy to overconsume. One reason for this is energy density. Many highly processed foods deliver a large number of calories in a small physical volume. The stomach, however, partly relies on stretch and volume to help generate fullness. If a food delivers a great deal of energy without taking up much space, the body can receive more fuel than expected before fullness feels obvious. This creates a mismatch. Calorie intake rises quickly, but the mechanical feeling of having eaten enough does not always rise with it. The person eating may not feel especially full until much later, by which time a large amount has already been consumed. Texture plays a role too. Foods that are crisp, creamy, melting, or otherwise very easy to chew and swallow can move through the mouth quickly. And that matters because the pace of eating influences satiety. Slower eating gives hormones, nerves, and the brain a chance to catch up. Faster eating can outrun them. A meal eaten slowly with pauses, chewing, and a bit of attention often creates a different experience from food eaten quickly from a packet, while standing in the kitchen or looking at a screen. Yet modern foods are often built for speed. They are designed to go down easily and encourage another bite before the last signal has really arrived. This would be manageable if food only appeared at clear meal times, but modern life rarely offers such clarity. Snacking has become normal in many places, not as an occasional response to genuine hunger, but as a steady background behaviour. Food is kept at desks, in cars, in bags, in office kitchens, by checkout counters, in cinema seats, beside sofas and on bedside tables. Eating is no longer neatly separated from the rest of life. It leaks into it. The body's appetite system, which depends partly on rhythm and contrast, now has to operate in a world where there is almost always another opportunity within reach. That constant availability changes the meaning of hunger. If eating happens every time a mild appetite signal appears, the body may have fewer chances to move clearly between hunger, eating, and fullness. Instead of strong, distinct waves, appetite becomes a low-level hum, interrupted by frequent snacks and cues. Some people describe this as never feeling truly hungry, and never feeling truly satisfied either. That description makes a great deal of sense. The system has lost its clearer edges. Signals overlap, meals blur into snacks, snacks blur into habits, and the body's older rhythm becomes harder to hear. Frequent snacking can also interfere with how hunger hormones behave. Ghrelin tends to rise and fall around meal patterns, and while it is not a perfect clock, it does respond to routine. When eating becomes irregular and constant, ghrelin patterns may become less clear, appetite may feel more intrusive, and the distinction between physiological hunger and cue-driven eating becomes harder to notice. The body is trying to predict food, but the pattern is messy, so the signal becomes messier as well. There is another problem with many common snack foods, which is that they often deliver reward without producing much lasting satiety. A small packet of something salty, crunchy, sweet, or creamy can feel highly appealing in the moment, but if it is low in protein, low in fibre, and quick to digest, it may not quiet appetite for long. In some cases, it may do the opposite. It may take the sharp edge off hunger without creating a sense of completion, leaving a person both stimulated and still somewhat unsatisfied. That is an uncomfortable combination, and it helps explain why one snack often leads to another thought of food soon after. This is not merely about calories or lack of self-control. It is about the kind of information the body receives. A food that offers quick energy but little lasting satiety tells the system something very different from a more balanced meal. The brain gets reward, the bloodstream gets fuel. But the slower, steadier signals associated with fullness may remain weak. The result is that eating happens, but regulation does not really settle. The reward side of this is especially important. Highly processed foods tend to be unusually good at activating dopamine-related circuits involved in motivation and wanting. That does not mean dopamine is simply a pleasure chemical. It is more accurate to say that it helps mark things as worth pursuing. When certain foods repeatedly deliver strong reward, the brain learns that they matter. Cues associated with them become more powerful. Packaging, sounds, times of day, places, even moods can become linked to the expectation of eating. Once that happens, appetite is no longer only responding to internal need. It is responding to learned anticipation. This is why someone can walk into a room, see a bowl of sweets, and feel interest in eating without having been hungry a moment before. The cue activates a learned system. The body remembers that this kind of object usually leads to reward. Hunger may not have been absent before, but the cue amplifies it and gives it direction. The person experiences this as a sudden desire, but the desire is part biology, part learning, and part environment. Modern life is full of such cues, and they are not harmless decorations. They are invitations to appetite. Advertising multiplies this effect by keeping food mentally present, even when it is not physically nearby. Images of melting cheese, glossy pastries, crisp chips, dripping sauces, and giant cold drinks do not simply inform. They stimulate. They rehearse desire. They keep the brain's food maps active. This matters because appetite is easier to trigger when food is already mentally close. In older environments, a person had to encounter food more directly. Now they may see dozens of food prompts before lunch, without consciously noticing how much those prompts are shaping attention and craving. Portion size adds another layer of confusion. Over time, larger portions can become normalized, which changes the brain's expectations about what counts as a proper amount. The body still has its internal signals, but expectation powerfully shapes how meals are experienced. If a person repeatedly eats very large portions, smaller meals may feel emotionally insufficient even when they are physiologically reasonable. The stomach adapts to patterns too. Habitual large intake can make moderate portions feel oddly temporary, not because they are inadequate, but because the system has learned a different baseline. Liquid calories complicate matters further. Sugary drinks, flavoured coffees, smoothies, and other calorie-containing beverages can provide a surprising amount of energy without creating the same fullness as solid food. The body does register liquid intake, but often not with the same strength of satiety as food that requires chewing and sits more substantially in the stomach. This creates another mismatch between energy intake and perceived fullness. A person may consume hundreds of calories in drinks and still feel ready to eat soon afterward, then blame themselves for having no control when the physiology was tilted from the start. There is also the issue of variety, which on the surface sounds like a good thing. In nutritional terms, some variety is beneficial, but when variety means many highly palatable foods available at once, appetite can stay active longer than it otherwise would. The brain begins to tire of one flavour, but wakes up again for another. A salty food does not close the door on sweetness. A soft texture does not cancel interest in crunch. This phenomenon helps explain why buffets, holiday tables and snack spreads are so easy to overeat from. Fullness is trying to develop, but sensory novelty keeps reward interested. The body is saying one thing, the environment is saying another, and the brain keeps trying to honour both. The social world strengthens this modern trap in quiet ways. Food is offered as friendliness, celebration, comfort, productivity support, and background entertainment. Meetings have pastries, films have snacks, travel has treats, tiredness has takeout, weekends have indulgence. None of this is inherently wrong, but it does mean eating is tied to many events that have nothing to do with biological hunger. The body begins to associate food with transitions, rewards, companionship, and relief. Over time, these associations can become so normal that the absence of food feels slightly incomplete, even when no real hunger exists. Then there is convenience itself, which may be one of the biggest appetite distorters of all. The human body evolved in conditions where obtaining food often required some form of effort. Effort does not simply burn calories, it creates spacing. It gives appetite time to build and be noticed. It allows eating to feel like a response to a meaningful signal. In modern settings, effort has shrunk dramatically. Food can be purchased in seconds, delivered to the door, opened instantly, and eaten with one hand. This makes life easier, but it also reduces the natural pauses that once helped appetite self-organize. Without those pauses, impulsive eating becomes more likely. A thought becomes an action almost immediately. The brain's reward circuits love this arrangement. Wanting and getting are brought very close together. Over time, that closeness can strengthen habit loops. A mild cue or emotion appears, and food follows so quickly that the whole chain becomes automatic. The person later experiences the result as constant hunger, but sometimes the system has been trained less by hunger itself than by immediate reinforcement. The body is learning that many small prompts reliably lead to eating, so it begins surfacing those prompts more often. Stress and fatigue make the modern trap even stickier. When people are tired or overwhelmed, they're usually less interested in cooking balanced meals and more interested in whatever is easiest. Highly processed convenience foods become especially attractive under those conditions because they ask almost nothing in return. They are fast, reliable, and rewarding. Unfortunately, the same conditions that make them appealing also weaken appetite regulation. Poor sleep increases hunger signals and food cue reactivity. Stress increases the appeal of comfort and relief. So the person most likely to reach for quick processed food is often the same person whose hunger signals are already least clear. This is one reason the cycle can feel so difficult to escape. A stressful day leads to convenience eating. Convenience eating may not satisfy very well. Snacking fills the gaps. Full meals become less distinct. Appetite feels chaotic. Sleep worsens. The next day the body is hungrier, more reward sensitive and more reactive to cues. None of this requires a dramatic failure. It can happen slowly, through ordinary modern habits that seem harmless in isolation. Another quiet trap is the idea that small foods do not count. A biscuit here, a handful of crackers there, a coffee drink, a few sweets from a bowl, some bites while cooking, a little something after dinner because dinner somehow did not complete itself. Individually, these moments may seem trivial, but physiologically they still shape appetite signals. They interrupt fasting periods, alter expectations, keep reward loops active, and blur the body's sense of meal structure. The problem is not the moral status of snacks. The problem is that when eating becomes too frequent and too unremarkable, the body loses a clearer sense of beginning, middle, and end. It is also worth saying that processed foods are not uniquely dangerous, because they are evil or unnatural in some dramatic philosophical sense. The issue is much more practical. Many of them are simply very good at bypassing the slower, more reliable aspects of appetite regulation. They deliver reward quickly, volume inefficiently, and satiety inconsistently. In an environment where they are constantly available, it becomes much easier for appetite to be driven by cue and reward rather than by the body's steadier needs. This helps explain why some people feel much hungrier in certain environments than in others. At home, with regular meals, they may feel reasonably stable. In an office full of snacks during travel, at parties, or while spending long evenings in front of screens with easy food nearby, appetite seems to expand strangely. The body has not changed overnight. The signal environment has. More cues, more reward, more convenience, more variety, more interruptions. Hunger and fullness are trying to speak, but modern life keeps speaking over them. None of this means a person must eat perfectly or fear every processed food. That would only add another layer of tension to an already noisy system. The more helpful lesson is that appetite responds to structure. It usually works better when meals are distinct, when food contains elements that support satiety, when eating is not constant, when reward is part of the meal but not the only thing in it, and when the environment is not endlessly asking the brain whether it would like one more bite of something engineered to be irresistible. This is where meal composition starts to matter in a more practical way. Protein, fibre, food volume, and a reasonable pace of eating give the body more tools for generating clear satiety, not because they are magical, but because they help align mechanical fullness, hormonal response, and mental satisfaction. Compare that to a day built on snack foods, sugary drinks, and quick processed items eaten between tasks. The second day is not only lower in nutritional steadiness, it is often louder in appetite. The body receives many signals, but not many clear conclusions. People sometimes say they feel hungrier the more they eat, when their eating has become snack-heavy and highly processed, and in a way that can be true. Not because food creates hunger out of nowhere, but because certain kinds of eating keep the appetite system active without bringing it to rest. Reward is stimulated, but satiety is partial. Hunger is softened, but not resolved. Then cues appear again, and the loop begins another round. In a calmer food environment, the body can often rediscover a more legible rhythm. Hunger rises, a meal happens, satisfaction and fullness develop, appetite settles. There is a pause before the next need. This rhythm is not perfect and not mechanical, but it is much easier to feel when food is not interrupting constantly from every direction. The body still lives in the modern world, of course, but it can handle that world more smoothly when the signal noise is reduced a little. That signal noise is not only about food itself, though. It is also about the conditions under which the body is trying to regulate appetite. And one of the strongest conditions of all, often underestimated because it feels so ordinary, is sleep. Along with the quiet pressure of stress that builds around a tired mind and a tired body until hunger starts sounding louder than it should. There are days when hunger feels less like a gentle signal and more like a running commentary that never quite stops. You eat breakfast and start thinking about lunch earlier than usual. You finish lunch and still feel as though something small, pleasant, and preferably made of sugar or salt would improve the afternoon. Evening arrives and the appetite that might normally feel manageable now seems louder, more restless, less willing to settle. On these days, people often tell themselves that they must have eaten badly, or that they are simply being indulgent, or that they need to be stricter and ignore it. But very often the deeper answer is much less dramatic and much more biological. They are tired. They are stressed. Their body is asking for more, because the systems that regulate hunger and fullness are working under strain. This is one of the most reliable patterns in appetite, and one of the most underestimated. Sleep and stress are not side notes in the story of hunger. They are central characters. They influence hormones, attention, reward, mood, decision-making, energy use, and the brain's interpretation of need. When sleep is poor or stress is chronic, the body does not simply become a little grumpier. It becomes more interested in food, more reactive to cues, less satisfied by ordinary meals, and more inclined to seek the quick comfort of energy-dense foods. The result is not imaginary. It is not weakness. It is the appetite system doing its best in a body that feels a little cornered. Sleep is the easier place to begin because its effects on hunger are surprisingly direct. When a person sleeps well, the systems involved in appetite tend to speak more clearly. Ghrelin and leptin move in more stable patterns. Reward circuits are less jumpy. The prefrontal cortex, which helps with planning, perspective, and inhibition, tends to function better. Hunger rises and falls in a way that usually feels more proportional to the day. But when sleep is shortened, delayed, or repeatedly disturbed, that balance begins to shift. One common effect of poor sleep is that ghrelin tends to rise, while leptin signalling may become less favourable. In simple terms, the body becomes more inclined to ask for food and somewhat less persuasive when trying to say enough. This hormonal shift does not necessarily create dramatic hunger in a single, theatrical moment. More often, it changes the tone of the whole day. Food seems more relevant. The idea of eating becomes stickier. It takes less of a cue to pull appetite into awareness, and once a meal has happened, satisfaction can feel thinner and less durable than usual. That last part matters a great deal. When people are tired, they often expect hunger to mean they need more calories because they feel low on energy. Sometimes that is partly true. Staying awake longer can slightly increase energy requirements, but the appetite change after poor sleep is usually larger than that small energy difference alone would predict. The body is not simply asking for fuel because it has burned a little extra. It is changing the way it values food. Tiredness makes reward more compelling. It makes immediate relief feel more important than longer-term balance. It makes the body and brain more eager to treat food as a fast solution. That shift in valuation is visible in the kinds of foods people tend to want when they are sleep-deprived. Usually it is not plain lentils and a sensible portion of fish. It is often sweet, salty, fatty, starchy, soft, crunchy, comforting food. Food that asks very little and promises something quickly. This pattern is not accidental. A tired brain becomes more responsive to rewarding stimuli and less enthusiastic about effort, delay, and moderation. Food that is easy to eat and strongly pleasurable fits that condition almost perfectly. At the same time, tiredness tends to weaken the mental functions that help people pause, evaluate, and notice what is happening. The prefrontal regions of the brain, which are involved in self-regulation and decision-making, do not perform as well after poor sleep. This means that appetite is not only louder, the internal systems that might help put it in perspective are softer. Food cues feel more persuasive, and the ability to say, "Actually, I know what this is and I'd rather wait," becomes harder to access. Not impossible, but harder. A person in that state may later describe the day as one in which they had no willpower, but the better description is that they were trying to regulate appetite with a brain that had fewer tools available. There is also the simple fact that sleep deprivation makes ordinary life feel heavier. Concentration takes more effort. Mood is more fragile. Small frustrations feel larger. Tasks that would normally be tolerable begin to seem oddly personal, as if the printer is deliberately trying to humiliate you. In that state, food can start functioning as an accessible form of relief. Not because a person is foolish or broken, but because their body has fewer reserves for discomfort and their brain is more attracted to quick reward. Hunger and relief-seeking begin to overlap. The desire to eat is no longer only about energy. It is also about easing strain. This overlap becomes even stronger when stress enters the picture, especially the kind of stress that does not arrive as a single emergency, but lingers as a background condition. Acute stress can suppress appetite in some people. If the body senses immediate threat, it may temporarily shift attention away from digestion and hunger. That is why some people lose interest in food during intense arguments, sudden bad news, or frightening situations. But chronic stress often behaves differently. Instead of shutting appetite down, it can distort it, making hunger more irregular, more emotionally loaded, and more tied to comfort and reward. Part of this involves cortisol, one of the body's main stress hormones. Cortisol is not bad in itself. It helps mobilize energy, supports alertness, and plays an important role in daily rhythm and adaptation. But when stress becomes prolonged and cortisol patterns become less healthy, the effects on appetite can become troublesome. In some people, elevated or dysregulated stress hormones increase appetite, particularly for foods that are high in sugar and fat. The body under chronic stress is not merely asking for calories, it is trying to stabilize itself, and highly palatable food can look like a fast way to do that. This makes sense from a short-term biological perspective. Stress can be metabolically demanding. It can disrupt sleep, raise inflammation, increase muscle tension, and keep the nervous system in a state of readiness. The body may begin nudging toward quick energy and easy comfort, because those are both useful in the immediate sense. The trouble is that modern stress rarely comes from short physical emergencies that end cleanly. It often comes from work pressure, financial strain, emotional burden, social conflict, information overload, caregiving, uncertainty, and the strange exhaustion of always being available to messages. These stresses can last for weeks, months, or years. Appetite systems that were meant to help through shorter periods of strain end up being pushed for too long. One consequence of chronic stress is that people often lose contact with the subtle distinctions between different bodily states. Tiredness, boredom, anxiety, loneliness, irritation, and hunger begin to blur. A person may feel a vague internal discomfort and interpret it as appetite simply because food is a familiar and available response. This is not because they are making it up. Stress genuinely changes body signals. The stomach can feel unsettled, blood sugar can shift, hormones can nudge, the mind can become more food-focused. The body is speaking, but the message is crowded and mixed. I need rest, I need a break, I need comfort, and I need fuel begin to sound similar. That is one reason evening hunger can feel so intense after a stressful day. By then, several things have accumulated. A person may have undereaten earlier because they were too busy or too tense to notice hunger properly. Mental fatigue has built. Stress has increased the appeal of comforting food. Self-control has been used repeatedly on work, social interactions, and practical tasks. The body wants both energy and relief. Then the person arrives home, sees food, and appetite surges in a way that feels disproportionate. Yet it is rarely disproportionate when viewed in context. The system has been collecting pressure all day. Sleep loss and stress also amplify each other in a rather rude and unhelpful partnership. Poor sleep makes stress feel more intense. Stress makes good sleep harder to achieve. Together they create a state in which hunger signals become more unreliable and more demanding. A person sleeps badly because they are stressed, wakes tired, feels hungrier and more Q-reactive through the day, eats in a more chaotic way, ends up uncomfortable or guilty in the evening, and then sleeps badly again. This is not a dramatic failure of character. It is a biological loop, and it can become quite stubborn if no one points out what is happening. Another important factor is that both sleep deprivation and chronic stress affect how rewarding food feels. This is not just about liking food more, though that can happen. It is about the brain assigning more importance to the relief and pleasure food seems able to provide. Under strain, the brain becomes more interested in certainty, familiarity, and speed. Food offers all three. It is predictable, it is available, it changes sensation quickly. If the day has felt emotionally expensive, the brain can begin treating food not as a meal but as a solution. Again, not necessarily a wise solution in the long run, but a compelling one in the moment. The body also learns from repetition. If someone often eats in response to stress or fatigue, that pattern becomes easier to trigger over time. A difficult meeting, a restless night, an afternoon slump, a quiet, lonely evening, all can begin to cue appetite even before true hunger is especially strong. The brain has learned that these states are followed by food, and it begins preparing for food in anticipation. Ghrelin may rise around expected eating times. Reward circuits may become active around familiar conditions. The person then feels hungry and assumes the hunger came from nowhere, when in fact it came from a learned association layered on top of physiology. This does not mean that stress eating or tired eating is fake. It is still real appetite, real motivation, real body chemistry. The point is simply that the source is broader than energy need alone. The body is asking for something, but that something may be part fuel, part soothing, part routine, and part rescue from overwhelm. No wonder it can be hard to satisfy with one simple meal. There is also the question of meal composition under stress and fatigue, because drained people tend to make different food choices for understandable reasons. When exhausted, most people do not want to build a careful meal with protein, fibre, colour and balance. They want easy, they want quick, they want whatever requires the least thought and offers the most immediate relief. Unfortunately, those foods often do not regulate hunger very well. They may be high in refined carbohydrates, low in protein, easy to overeat, and not especially lasting in terms of satiety. So the meal that seemed like a rescue becomes the beginning of another appetite cycle. Relief arrives briefly, then fades, and the body asks again. Caffeine complicates this picture too. When sleep is poor, people often increase caffeine to stay functional. Caffeine can temporarily blunt appetite in some cases, especially early in the day, which may lead to skipped meals or undereating. Then later, as fatigue and appetite return together, hunger can feel abrupt and intense. This pattern is common. Little appetite in the morning, a rushed lunch or none at all, then powerful evening eating. The body is not inconsistent. It is reacting to delayed signals, stimulants, fatigue, and cumulative underfueling. Hunger arrives late, but it arrives with interest. The emotional side of this deserves care as well, because people often feel ashamed of how food behaviour changes when life is hard. They imagine that needing more comfort from food is childish or weak. But from the body's point of view, seeking comfort under stress is entirely ordinary. Humans regulate distress through rhythm, warmth, familiarity, social contact, repetitive behaviour, and sensory pleasure. Food can provide several of those at once. The real problem is not that this happens. The real problem is that food is often the most available comfort in modern life, while sleep, rest, quiet, and emotional support are harder to obtain. The body reaches for what is accessible. That accessibility is why a tired and stressed person can appear always hungry, even when the deeper issue is under recovery. The body is under-rested, under-soothed, overstimulated, and perhaps underfed in a useful sense if meals have been irregular or poorly composed. Appetite begins carrying messages that really belong to several systems at once. The person then tries to answer those messages only with food, and food cannot solve all of them. It may help briefly, but it cannot become sleep, peace, completion, or emotional safety. So the request returns, dressed again, as hunger. One of the most helpful realizations in this whole area is that appetite often improves when recovery improves, even before anything else changes dramatically. Better sleep can make ordinary meals feel more satisfying. Lower stress can soften the urgency around snacks and sweets. Consistent meal timing can reduce the evening rebound of delayed hunger. A body that feels less cornered usually asks for food more proportionally. It is not that hunger disappears, it simply begins sounding more like hunger and less like a blend of emergency, reward-seeking, and exhaustion. This is also why addressing hunger only by trying to be stronger often fails when the real issue is sleep and stress. A person can use discipline for a while, but if the body remains tired and strained, appetite will keep speaking loudly. It is much easier to interpret hunger accurately when the nervous system is not frayed. It is much easier to stop eating when fullness is clearer. It is much easier to choose balanced food when the brain is not begging for the fastest available comfort. Of course, no one can simply decide to sleep perfectly and stop being stressed forever by Wednesday. Life is less cooperative than that. But even small improvements can matter. Regular sleep timing, reducing late-night light exposure, eating more substantial meals earlier in the day instead of drifting into evening starvation, and building moments of actual recovery into the day can all help the body regulate appetite more cleanly. These are not glamorous solutions, which is perhaps why they are often ignored. But the body responds to them because the body likes steadiness. It also helps to notice that hunger on a tired day is not a verdict. It is information, The body is saying that conditions have changed. Reward feels more important. Satiety may be less clear. Energy management is under strain. That information can be met with curiosity instead of accusation. Rather than saying, "Why am I like this?" a kinder and more accurate question is, "What is my body dealing with today that is making food feel so necessary?" Sometimes the answer will be genuine undereating, sometimes it will be exhaustion, sometimes stress, often it will be a combination, and that combination matters because when poor sleep and chronic stress keep repeating, the body's hunger system does not only become louder in the short term, over time it can begin shifting into a more persistent pattern, where signals that should help regulate appetite, especially those involving leptin, stop being heard as clearly as they ought to be. There is a cruel little irony in the way appetite works. The body can be carrying plenty of stored energy, and yet the brain can continue behaving as though energy is uncertain, precarious, and worth pursuing with unusual urgency. To the person living inside that experience, it can feel baffling. Hunger appears too often. Meals do not seem to settle things for very long. Food stays mentally loud. Fullness arrives, perhaps, but not with much authority. It is like having a signal in the room that should be calming everyone down, only no one seems to be listening. This is where leptin becomes especially important, because leptin is one of the main hormones meant to tell the brain that stored energy exists, that reserves are available, and that appetite does not need to be so forceful. When that message is no longer being heard clearly, the whole conversation around hunger changes. Leptin is produced mainly by fat tissue. In broad terms, more stored body fat usually means more circulating leptin. That sounds straightforward, and at first glance it suggests an obvious outcome. If more stored energy leads to more leptin, and leptin is meant to reduce appetite, then people with more stored energy should simply feel less driven to eat. But biology is rarely so tidy. In many cases, the opposite seems to happen. Leptin levels may be high, yet hunger remains strong, fullness remains unconvincing, and the brain acts as though reserves are less secure than they really are. This mismatch is often described as leptin resistance. The phrase can sound mechanical, as though the body has turned into a stubborn appliance refusing to recognize its own settings. In reality, leptin resistance is better understood as a communication problem. The hormone is there, the message exists, but the response in the brain is blunted, distorted, or weakened. It is rather like someone knocking on a door that used to open easily, except the person inside now hears only a faint tapping, or hears it so often that it no longer changes their behaviour. The signal has not vanished, its effect has. This matters because leptin is not just another small detail in the appetite system. It is one of the main ways the body informs the brain about long-term energy status. Ghrelin can tell the brain that food is timely and relevant. The stomach can say that it is full or empty. Gut hormones can say that nutrients are arriving. But leptin tells a broader story. It tells the brain something about the pantry, not just the plate. It says whether reserves are low or abundant, whether the system should lean toward urgency or toward calm. When that background information becomes less effective, the brain tends to err on the side of caution. And caution, in the language of appetite, usually means a stronger push toward eating. From the brain's point of view, this makes an unfortunate kind of sense. The brain is not trying to produce beauty or discipline, it is trying to protect survival. If it becomes less responsive to signals that indicate plentiful stored energy, it begins behaving as though energy might be less available than it appears. Appetite increases. Energy expenditure may decline somewhat. Food becomes more salient. The body's behaviour shifts toward preservation. This is not a conscious strategy. It is a protective response built into the system. But in a modern environment full of easily available food, that protective response can feel like an endless and deeply annoying misfire. People often imagine that persistent hunger in a body with substantial energy stores must mean the hunger is somehow false. But from the perspective of lived experience and brain response, the hunger is real. The person truly feels more driven to eat. The brain truly treats food as more relevant. The difficulty lies not in whether the appetite exists, but in whether it matches the body's objective energy situation. Leptin resistance helps explain why those two things can drift apart. One of the reasons this becomes so frustrating is that leptin does not usually work as a dramatic immediate stop signal. It does not shout over a meal and say, "Put the fork down at once." Its influence is more like a background tone that makes satiety easier to achieve and hunger less intrusive. When leptin signaling is working well, the body's other appetite signals exist within a calmer context. Hunger arrives, but it does not always feel like a negotiation with a hostage taker. Meals satisfy more naturally. The brain does not remain so fixated on food once enough has been eaten. When leptin signaling weakens, that calming background begins to disappear. The body still tries to regulate appetite, but it does so with less help from one of its major long-term guides. This is why people in a leptin-resistant state often describe a feeling that fullness exists physically, but not convincingly. The stomach can be full, the meal can be substantial. Yet there remains an unsettled quality, as though the brain did not fully accept the message that enough has happened. That can lead to continued eating, frequent snacking, or a constant low-level awareness of food that is mentally exhausting. Once again, this is not because the body is irrational in some simple sense. It is because one of the main signals meant to quiet food seeking has become less persuasive. Why does this happen? There is no single neat cause, but several factors are strongly associated with reduced leptin sensitivity. Chronic overnutrition, particularly in the setting of highly processed energy-dense foods, appears to be one important contributor. When leptin levels remain high over long periods, the brain's response may become less sensitive, much as repeated exposure to many signals can reduce how strongly they are felt. Inflammation, especially in certain areas of the brain involved in appetite regulation, is also thought to play a role. So are disruptions in sleep, stress hormones, insulin signaling, and broader metabolic health. The system is not failing for one magical reason. It is being shaped by a whole environment of repeated inputs. This is one of the reasons modern life can be so difficult for appetite regulation. The body's energy management systems evolved for scarcity, interruption, and effort. They were not built for constant access to highly rewarding food, irregular sleep, chronic psychosocial stress, minimal movement, and endless low-grade stimulation. Under these conditions, the appetite system is asked to do a very old job in very new circumstances. Leptin resistance is one way that mismatch can show itself. The body has plenty stored, but the brain no longer responds to that abundance as effectively as it should. Inflammation is worth lingering on for a moment because it often sounds abstract, and yet it has very practical consequences. Low-grade chronic inflammation can arise from several factors, including excess visceral fat, poor sleep, stress, sedentary behavior, and certain dietary patterns. When inflammatory signaling affects the hypothalamus and related brain systems, it may interfere with how clearly leptin's message gets through. The brain is still receiving input, but it is receiving it through a foggier channel. That makes the appetite system less precise. Hunger becomes louder than expected. Fullness becomes less reliable. The body's internal communication starts sounding as though it is travelling through a bad phone connection. Insulin resistance often overlaps with this picture as well. Insulin and leptin are different hormones with different jobs, but they interact in important ways within the broader energy regulation system. When insulin signaling becomes impaired, the body's overall metabolic environment changes, and appetite regulation often becomes less stable. This does not mean insulin resistance automatically causes leptin resistance or vice versa, but the two often appear in the same wider landscape of dysregulation. Meals may lead to more volatile energy states. Hunger may return sooner or feel less proportional, and the body's sense of security around energy can remain oddly shaky. In that kind of metabolic climate, leptin's calming role becomes even more important and, sadly, often less effective. Sleep is another major influence here. We have already talked about how poor sleep increases hunger and changes food preference in the short term. But over time, repeated sleep disruption can also contribute to the broader environment in which leptin signaling becomes less helpful. When sleep is poor, appetite hormones shift, stress physiology is more active, inflammation tends to worsen, glucose regulation becomes less tidy, and the brain becomes more reward sensitive. The result is not just a hungrier day, it is a body that is gradually harder to regulate. Leptin may still be present in large amounts, but the brain hearing it is sleep-deprived, stressed, and increasingly suspicious that quick energy might be urgently useful. This creates a particularly painful trap for many people. The worse sleep gets, the louder appetite becomes. The louder appetite becomes, the easier it is to rely on foods and routines that worsen metabolic health. The worse metabolic health becomes, the less effective leptin signaling may be. Then the next day arrives with more hunger, less satisfaction, and another round of wondering why food feels so impossible to stop thinking about. It is not a moral collapse, it is a loop. Stress deepens this loop in its own unfriendly way. Chronic stress does not simply make people eat their feelings in a cartoon sense. It changes cortisol patterns, worsens sleep, increases reward seeking, raises inflammation, and can encourage the storage of visceral fat in some individuals. Over time, this adds pressure to the very systems meant to keep appetite balanced. The body under chronic stress begins behaving more defensively. It is less willing to trust that energy is secure. It leans toward preservation. And because leptin is one of the hormones meant to say, there is enough in reserve, you can ease off. Reduced sensitivity to leptin makes that defensive posture harder to turn down. There is also a psychological consequence to leptin resistance that deserves attention because it shapes behavior in very real ways. When food stays mentally loud, people often assume the appropriate response is stronger discipline. They try to out-argue appetite, they impose harsher rules, they tighten restriction. They tell themselves they simply must ignore hunger more decisively. But if the brain is already underhearing one of the main signals of energy sufficiency, harsh restriction often makes the whole situation worse. Hunger increases further. Food thoughts intensify. The reward value of eating rises. Any temporary control is often followed by rebound eating that feels dramatic and humiliating. This pattern is tragically common. A person senses that their appetite is stronger than it should be. They respond by trying to suppress it forcefully. The body responds by escalating hunger signals and sharpening food focus. Eventually, eating becomes difficult to control, and the person blames themselves more. Yet much of this pattern can be understood biologically. A brain that does not hear leptin clearly is already uneasy. Add rigid restriction, and it becomes more uneasy still. The result is not virtue, it is pressure. Another clue that leptin signaling may not be doing its job well is when weight loss triggers an especially intense increase in hunger and preoccupation with food. Some increase in hunger during weight loss is normal, because leptin levels naturally fall as body fat decreases. The body interprets this as a loss of energy reserve and responds protectively. But in individuals who already have an unstable appetite system or reduced leptin sensitivity, this process can feel especially severe. The body is losing stored energy, leptin levels are falling, and the brain becomes even more motivated to restore what it perceives as a threat to reserves. Meals that once felt adequate no longer do. Hunger becomes insistent. Food dominates mental space. Weight maintenance becomes extremely difficult. This is one reason sustained weight loss is so biologically challenging for many people. Popular culture often treats it as a simple question of commitment, but the body does not experience it that way. From the body's perspective, reduced stored energy can represent risk, and leptin is one of the major ways that risk is communicated. When leptin falls, the system responds by encouraging regain. If leptin signaling was already somewhat distorted before the weight loss, the resulting experience can feel especially punishing. None of this means change is impossible. It means changes occurring inside a body with its own priorities, most of which were designed long before modern ideas about body image and dietary virtue entered the room. The brain's response to leptin also intersects with reward in an important way. When leptin signaling is strong, highly rewarding foods may still be enjoyable, but they do not always command the same relentless attention. When leptin signaling is weak, the reward system tends to have more influence. Food cues become more attention-grabbing. Palatable foods seem harder to dismiss. The brain becomes more interested in immediate energy, immediate comfort, immediate pleasure. This creates the impression that a person is simply obsessed with food, when a more accurate description might be that the brain is receiving too little calming context from a major satiety-related hormone and too much stimulation from the reward environment. This can be especially noticeable in modern food settings. Buffets, takeaway apps, snack cupboards, office treats, streaming television with dessert nearby, brightly packaged foods designed to promise delight in 6 bites or fewer. A brain that hears leptin clearly may still be tempted, of course. Humans are not stone statues, but a brain with reduced leptin sensitivity is often operating with less background reassurance. The food environment feels louder because the internal signal that should reduce urgency is quieter. The world appears more edible. There is also a social cruelty in how this is interpreted. People often assume that hunger in larger bodies must be exaggerated, indulgent, or somehow self-created in a trivial way. They imagine that because there is visible stored energy, the person should not really feel driven to eat. But the subjective experience of appetite depends on brain signaling, not on other people's opinions about what appetite ought to feel like. If the brain is not responding properly to leptin, hunger can be quite real and quite frequent. Shame does not correct that. If anything, shame worsens stress, sleep, and emotional eating, adding more strain to an already strained system. It is also worth noticing that leptin resistance does not usually appear alone as a dramatic diagnosis that politely announces itself. It tends to emerge gradually in the context of broader metabolic dysregulation. A person may first notice that they feel hungry more often, that meals do not keep them full as long, that highly palatable foods feel unusually difficult to resist, that weight seems easier to gain and harder to lose, that sleep is poor, that stress is high, that energy fluctuates. Each symptom on its own may look ordinary. Together they form a pattern. The body is becoming harder to regulate because several systems are moving off balance at once, and leptin's voice is no longer cutting through as it should. The hopeful part, if there is one, is that the system is not necessarily fixed forever in this state. Leptin sensitivity can improve, though usually not through dramatic tricks or intense restriction. The body responds better to steadiness than to punishment, better sleep, less chronic stress where possible, more regular meals, fewer violent swings between restriction and overeating, improved metabolic health, movement, and a reduction in the constant assault of hyperpalatable food cues can all help the body become more legible to itself again. This does not happen overnight, and it is not glamorous enough to sell in bold letters on a packet. But biology often prefers modest consistency to heroic bursts of effort, followed by collapse. Meal composition matters here too. Protein, fibre, and meals that actually satisfy both physically and psychologically can help reduce the constant pressure on the appetite system. Not because they directly fix leptin in a simple, magical way, but because they reduce the number of conflicting signals the brain has to process. A body that is fed more steadily and sleeps more reliably is easier to regulate than one ricocheting between stimulant-driven mornings, chaotic snacks, restrictive intentions, late-night overeating, and shallow sleep. Leptin is only one part of that system, but it benefits from a less chaotic environment. Movement helps as well, not merely because it burns energy, but because it supports metabolic flexibility, sleep quality, mood regulation, and insulin sensitivity. Again, not a punishment, not a trade for dessert, just one more way the body regains a clearer internal conversation. The appetite system likes bodies that move, rest, and eat in rhythms it can predict. It becomes noisier when everything is irregular, inflamed, and overstimulated. Above all, it helps to understand that when leptin stops being heard clearly, the resulting hunger is not a sign that the person is weak, greedy, or unteachable. It is a sign that the long-term energy communication system is under strain. The hormone that should be saying, "We have reserves, you may relax a little," is no longer changing the brain's behavior as effectively as before. And if that message is faint, the brain responds with caution. It makes food more important. It makes stopping harder. It makes appetite feel persistent. That persistence can be emotionally wearing. People begin to distrust themselves. They start every meal with a sense that they are entering a negotiation they will probably lose. They think about food more than they want to. They feel embarrassed by how mentally loud it remains. But once the biology is clearer, the experience becomes less mysterious. The body is not trying to sabotage them. It is speaking from a state of reduced internal reassurance. Hunger is louder because calm is quieter. And when calm is quieter, the whole cycle of craving, habit, reward, and repeated eating becomes easier to fall into and harder to interrupt, until appetite begins to feel less like a simple bodily need and more like a loop that keeps closing in on itself day after day. There is a point where hunger stops feeling like a clear signal and starts feeling like a pattern. Not a single moment, not a single meal, but something that repeats. You eat, and for a while things settle, but not completely. Later, the thought returns, not always as a sharp hunger, sometimes as a suggestion, sometimes as a quiet pull that says something small would help. You respond, and the cycle continues. Over time, it begins to feel as though appetite is not moving forward in a straight line, but circling back on itself, returning again and again in slightly different forms. This is where cravings, habits, and biological signals begin to merge into something that is difficult to separate. The body is still involved, of course. Hormones are still rising and falling. Energy is still being used and replenished. But layered on top of that is a learned rhythm, a set of loops that reinforce themselves. Hunger leads to eating. Eating leads to relief or reward. Relief or reward strengthens the connection. The next time a similar moment appears, the brain is already prepared. It does not wait for a full biological signal. It anticipates, and anticipation is often enough to begin the process again. This loop does not form all at once. It builds gradually, through repetition. A small snack after a meal becomes a routine. A treat during a stressful moment becomes expected. A quiet evening becomes associated with something sweet or salty. None of these actions are dramatic on their own. They are ordinary, human, understandable. But the brain is very good at learning patterns, especially patterns that involve reward. Once a pattern has been repeated enough times, it becomes easier to trigger and harder to interrupt. One of the key elements in this loop is the way the brain predicts outcomes. When you eat something enjoyable, the brain does not simply record that event. It begins to expect it under similar conditions. If you often eat a certain food in the evening, the brain starts preparing for that food before it appears. This preparation can feel like hunger, even if the body's energy needs have not changed. The signal is real, but it is partly driven by expectation rather than necessity. This is why cravings can feel so specific. Hunger in its basic form is flexible. It can be satisfied by a range of foods. Cravings tend to be more focused. They point toward a particular taste, texture, or experience. This focus is a sign that the brain is not only responding to energy need, but also to learned reward. It has identified a pattern that leads to a desirable outcome, and it is trying to repeat that pattern. The more often this pattern is followed, the stronger it becomes. Each repetition reinforces the connection between the cue and the behavior. Over time, the cue alone can be enough to trigger the response. You may find yourself wanting food at certain times of day, in certain places, or during certain emotional states, even if you are not physically hungry. The body has learned that these moments are associated with eating, and it begins to prepare accordingly. This preparation is not passive. It involves real changes in the body. Hormones can shift, saliva can increase, attention can narrow. The brain becomes more sensitive to food-related cues. The experience of craving is not just a thought, it is a state shaped by both biology and learning. This is why it can feel so compelling. It is not just a preference, it is a pattern that the body has practiced. Breaking this pattern is not as simple as deciding to stop. The loop is not maintained by conscious intention alone. It is supported by automatic processes that operate below awareness. When the cue appears, the response is already underway before you have time to evaluate it. This is why people often feel as though they're acting without thinking, or that the decision has been made before they fully notice it. At the same time, the loop is not fixed. It can change, but it requires a different approach from simple resistance. Trying to suppress a craving without understanding it often leads to increased tension. The brain becomes more focused on the denied food, and the craving can grow stronger. This is not because the person lacks control, but because attention itself can amplify desire. The more you focus on what you're trying to avoid, the more present it becomes. A more effective approach often involves recognizing the pattern and creating a pause. Not a forced, rigid pause, but a moment of awareness. Noticing the cue, the feeling, the urge, and the context in which it appears. This does not eliminate the craving, but it creates space between the signal and the response. In that space, different choices become possible. The loop is still there, but it is no longer automatic. Over time, repeated pauses can weaken the connection between cue and behavior. The brain learns that the pattern is not always followed, and the strength of the expectation begins to decrease. This process is gradual. It does not happen overnight, and it does not eliminate cravings entirely. But it can change their intensity and frequency, making them easier to manage. Another important aspect of this loop is the role of reward. Not all food is equally reinforcing. Highly palatable foods, especially those that combine sugar, fat, and salt, tend to create stronger reward signals. These signals are more likely to be remembered and repeated. This is why certain foods become the focus of cravings, while others do not. The brain is drawn to what has provided the most noticeable reward in the past. This does not mean that these foods are inherently problematic, but it does mean they are more likely to be involved in habitual patterns. When they are consumed frequently and in response to specific cues, they can become part of a loop that is difficult to interrupt. The goal is not to eliminate these foods entirely, but to understand how they fit into the pattern and how they influence the system. Meal structure also plays a role in this loop. When meals are irregular, or when they do not provide sufficient satiety, the body may remain in a state of partial hunger. This makes it easier for cravings to take hold because the baseline level of appetite is already elevated. In contrast, regular balanced meals can help stabilize appetite, reducing the intensity of the signals that drive the loop. This is one reason why skipping meals or eating very lightly during the day can lead to stronger cravings later on. The body accumulates a deficit, and when food becomes available, the drive to eat can be more intense. This is not simply a matter of willpower. It is a response to the body's need to restore balance. The loop becomes stronger because the underlying signals are stronger. Emotional factors also contribute to the cycle. Stress, boredom, loneliness, and fatigue can all act as cues for eating. When food is used to manage these states, it becomes part of the loop. The brain learns that eating changes how you feel, and it begins to suggest eating whenever those feelings arise. This is not a conscious strategy. It is a learned association, reinforced by experience. Addressing this aspect of the loop often involves finding alternative ways to respond to these cues, not as a replacement in a strict sense, but as an expansion of options. If food is the only available response to stress or boredom, the loop will remain strong. If other responses are available and practiced, the brain has more choices, and the pattern can begin to shift. It's also important to consider the role of environment. Constant exposure to food cues can keep the loop active, making it harder to break. Reducing unnecessary cues, creating more structure around eating, and changing the context in which food is consumed can all help reduce the frequency of the loop. Again, this is not about control in a strict sense, but about creating conditions that support clearer signals. Over time, as patterns change, the loop can become less dominant. Cravings may still appear, but they may feel less urgent, less frequent, and less tied to specific cues. Hunger may begin to feel more aligned with actual need, rather than expectation or habit. This is not a complete transformation, but a gradual shift in how the system operates. Understanding this process can change how you relate to appetite. Instead of seeing it as a series of isolated events, it becomes a pattern that can be observed and influenced. The loop is not something you are trapped in. It is something that has been learned, and like all learned patterns, it can be adjusted over time. And as this loop begins to loosen, even slightly, something else becomes possible. Hunger can start to feel less like a constant presence and more like a signal that comes and goes, something that can be noticed without immediately needing to be acted on. By the time most people reach the question of hunger, they're usually asking it with a little more weariness than curiosity. They're not asking in the abstract, as a philosopher might ask what a river really is, or whether memory can be trusted. They're asking because something in daily life has become tiring. Food feels louder than they want it to feel. Appetite does not seem to match intention. Meals do not always bring the quiet they expected. The body asks for more, and then sometimes more again, and the mind begins to wonder whether hunger means what it used to mean, or whether it ever meant only one thing at all. That is the strange and often difficult truth waiting underneath this whole story. Hunger is never only about food. Food is the most obvious object in the scene. The thing placed on the plate, lifted in the hand, chewed, swallowed, counted, restricted, celebrated, regretted, and sought again. But hunger itself is broader than that. It is one of the body's main ways of translating need into feeling. Sometimes that need truly is energy. Sometimes it is rhythm. Sometimes it is satiety. Sometimes it is recovery. Sometimes it is comfort, predictability, stimulation, rest, or relief. The body, honest as it is, does not always label these neatly for us. It sends sensation. It creates urgency. It shapes attention. Then it waits for us to interpret what exactly is being asked for. This is why hunger can feel so confusing in a modern life. The body is using an ancient language, and we're trying to hear it in a world full of interruptions. We are tired, overstimulated, under-rested, often rushed, often distracted, often eating in pieces rather than in complete experiences. We're surrounded by foods designed to keep our attention, by routines that keep appetite irregular, by stress that pulls the nervous system into vigilance, by late nights that shift hormones, by habits that turn small wants into expected rituals. Then, somewhere in the middle of that, the body says something that feels like hunger. And perhaps it is hunger, but perhaps it is also the accumulated sound of many unmet needs gathering behind a single familiar voice. The body does this often. It bundles. It stacks one message on top of another until the final sensation appears simpler than its origins really are. Tiredness can look like appetite. Anxiety can feel like a stomach need. Understimulation can create a pull towards something sweet, crunchy, or novel. Loneliness can make warmth and comfort feel edible. Habit can arrive in the body with the shape of hunger, because the hour, the chair, the room, the evening light, the television, the cup in the hand have all quietly learned to point toward eating. None of this makes the feeling false. It makes it layered. There is something rather human in how disappointing that can be. Most people would prefer a cleaner arrangement. Eat when hungry, stop when full, continue peacefully. It would be lovely, efficient, morally satisfying. It would also require the body to behave like a tidy machine rather than a living system shaped by evolution, memory, reward, stress, sleep, social life, and all the unruly complications of being a person. Real appetite does not arrive as a polished instruction. It arrives a sensation influenced by context. Sometimes it is clear and kind. Sometimes it is mixed and demanding. Sometimes it asks for dinner. Sometimes it asks for the end of the day to feel softer than it currently does. If there is a comforting thought in all this, it may be that appetite is not random even when it feels unreasonable. The body is usually making sense according to the conditions it has been given. If hunger stays loud, there is often a reason. Perhaps meals are not satisfying enough in composition or pace. Perhaps sleep has been poor for too many nights in a row. Perhaps stress has been asking the nervous system to live in a more defensive state. Perhaps highly rewarding food has become woven into too many ordinary cues. Perhaps the brain is not hearing leptin as clearly as it should. Perhaps restriction has made the body more vigilant around food. Perhaps the person is simply running on too little of several things at once, and the body has chosen hunger as the easiest language to get attention. That last possibility matters. Hunger is persuasive. Of all the needs the body can signal, hunger is one of the hardest to ignore politely. Thirst can sometimes wait. Fatigue can be pushed around, at least briefly, with caffeine and determination. Boredom can be numbed. Sadness can be hidden. But hunger, especially when it grows loud enough, has a forceful quality. It narrows focus. It insists. It reorganizes priorities. So if the body needs to get through to a person who has become very good at overlooking gentler messages, hunger is not a bad tool. It is inconvenient, certainly, but effective. Think of the number of quieter messages people routinely ignore. Slight tiredness becomes another task. Low mood becomes productivity. Stress becomes normal. The body asks for rest, and the calendar says no. The nervous system asks for safety, and the day offers deadlines. The mind asks for comfort, and the culture replies with optimization tips and a reusable water bottle. In that sort of life, subtler needs can go unheard for a long time. Hunger, however, tends to cut through. It says stop. It says notice. It says something is still unresolved here. Of course, food does genuinely resolve some things. It resolves energy shortage. It resolves the need for nutrients. It can resolve low blood sugar, weak concentration, irritability from undereating, the hollow pull of a stomach that has been empty too long. There is nothing wrong with that. Food is meant to solve hunger in the ordinary sense. The trouble begins when food is asked to solve many other things at the same time. Then the body may keep asking because the first answer was only partial. The meal may have fed the cells but not settled the nervous system. The snack may have offered pleasure but not rest. The dessert may have delivered comfort but not companionship. The second helping may have softened a difficult evening but not completed it. Then hunger, or something wearing hunger's clothes, returns. This is part of why people can feel so baffled after eating. They expect food to close the loop and sometimes it does not. But perhaps the body was not only asking for calories, perhaps it was also asking for pause, routine, grounding, warmth, or permission to stop doing everything else for a moment. A meal eaten standing up between messages may provide energy, but not much emotional completion. A snack eaten distractedly may register chemically, but not experientially. The body has been fed, but not deeply reassured. The person then finds themselves still wanting something, and concludes that they lack restraint, when often the deeper truth is that the original need was only partly nutritional. There is also a gentler, almost hopeful side to this realization. If hunger is not always only about food, then not every moment of appetite is a battle to be won or lost through discipline. Sometimes it is an invitation to ask a better question. Not, how do I stop wanting this? But, what else might my body be asking for right now? That question changes the atmosphere. It lowers accusation. It introduces curiosity. It makes room for the possibility that a person can be both hungry and also in need of something more than food. It allows appetite to become informative instead of merely inconvenient. This does not mean every craving is a sacred message from the depths of the soul, which would be a rather exhausting way to live. Sometimes a biscuit is just a biscuit, and sometimes the body simply wants lunch. The point is not to romanticize every appetite signal. The point is to stop flattening them all into moral tests. When hunger becomes constant, repetitive, or emotionally heavy, there is often useful information there. It may be about meal structure, it may be about sleep, it may be about chronic stress, it may be about habit and reward, it may be about the quiet misery of trying to live on rules that keep the body on edge. Listening well means sorting, not dramatizing. It can help to notice the texture of hunger when it arrives. Physical hunger often builds gradually. It tends to be flexible about what will satisfy it. It may come with a hollow feeling, reduced focus, a certain bodily sincerity. Habit hunger is often more punctual, tied to time or place. Reward hunger tends to be specific, interested in one food rather than food in general. Stress hunger may arrive fast and feel urgent, as if something must happen immediately. Tired hunger can have a hopeless little edge to it, wanting food not only for fuel, but because the world feels harder than it should. These categories overlap, of course, but even noticing their differences can soften confusion. There is dignity in learning this language, especially if a person has spent years treating appetite as an enemy. Many people move through life in a private feud with hunger. They do not trust it. They fear it. They try to outsmart it, suppress it, punish it, ignore it, or bargain with it. That is understandable in a culture that talks about appetite as though it were a small scandal. But the body does not usually benefit from being treated like a liar. Signals become easier to understand when they are approached with steadiness, not indulgence without thought, and not control without mercy. Steadiness. Steadiness sounds unimpressive, which is one of its strengths. It does not promise transformation by Thursday. It does not pose dramatically in the kitchen. It simply gives the body what helps it speak more clearly. Regular meals that actually satisfy. Enough protein and fibre to support satiety. Enough food earlier in the day to avoid evening desperation. Enough sleep that appetite hormones stop behaving like mischievous little saboteurs. Enough recovery that food does not have to do all the work of comfort. Enough rhythm that Ghrelin and the rest can settle into something recognisable. None of this is glamorous. Most biological truth is not. And yet, when the body gets more of what it actually needs, appetite often becomes less mysterious. Not perfect, never perfect, but more proportionate. Hunger starts sounding more like hunger. Fullness becomes easier to hear. Cravings still happen, because humans are not built to transcend crisp things and desert entirely, but they may lose some of their endless urgency. Food stops feeling like the answer to every discomfort because the body's receiving a few other answers too. It is worth saying, especially at a quiet hour like this, that many people are far more underrested than they are willing to admit. They think they need control over food when what they also need is sleep, stillness, and a little less pressure. A body that is always tired will ask for relief. A nervous system that never fully settles will keep searching for regulation. If food has become one of the main ways that regulation happens, the answer is rarely to shame the person for eating. The kinder and more effective answer is to ask what recovery has gone missing. Not instead of decent nutrition, but alongside it. The same goes for loneliness, which often hides in appetite more quietly than stress does. Shared meals regulate people in ways that are easy to overlook. Company slows eating, adds emotional satisfaction, makes a meal feel like an event rather than a transaction. Solitary eating is not bad, of course, but when life becomes too isolated, food can begin carrying some of the warmth that connection used to provide, A person may find themselves lingering over snacks at night not because they are especially hungry, but because the ritual creates a small sense of company and continuity. Again, food is not the enemy there. It is doing a job it was never meant to do alone. Boredom, too, deserves a little respect in this conversation. Understimulation is uncomfortable, and the brain has a low tolerance for empty space when it has been trained to expect constant novelty. Food offers sensation, timing, interruption, and reward. It chops a quiet evening into manageable little events. That can make boredom look very much like hunger. The body says something like, "Please, give me a reason for the next 10 minutes not to feel so flat." We hear that as appetite because appetite is a familiar root. Yet sometimes what is needed is not food, but stimulation of a different kind, or simply the ability to tolerate a little stillness without immediately trying to sweeten it. And then there is hope, oddly enough, which can also hide in hunger. Not hope in the grand heroic sense, but the small ordinary hope that the next thing might feel better than this thing. Food is uniquely good at offering that hope. The next bite might be satisfying, the next snack might complete the day, the next sweet thing might turn tiredness into comfort for a while. This is not irrational. The body has learned that food often changes internal state quickly. It is natural to reach toward that change. The problem is not that the hope exists. The problem is when it becomes the only quick hope available. Perhaps that is one of the quietest lessons in all of this. Hunger is sometimes asking for the next bite, yes, but it is often also asking for a life in which not every form of relief has to be swallowed. A life with pauses, with meals that feel complete, with sleep that actually restores, with enough nourishment that the body's not always scanning for more, with enough structure that appetite can form a rhythm, with enough kindness that one hungry day does not become a moral emergency. When those things improve, hunger often changes its tone. It becomes less desperate, less tangled, less like a constant referendum on character. None of this makes the body simple. Even in ideal conditions, appetite will remain a little inconsistent. Some days will be hungrier than others. Some meals will satisfy beautifully, and some will somehow miss the mark despite everyone's best efforts. Hormones will shift, stress will happen, sleep will go wrong. There will be evenings where dessert is clearly about dessert, and others where it is also about survival, in a smaller emotional sense. Being human means living with some of that mess. The goal was never perfect regulation. It was always deeper understanding, and understanding changes the atmosphere of experience. A person who sees hunger only as an obstacle tends to meet it with fear or irritation. A person who begins to see hunger as information can meet it differently. Not with blind obedience and not with rigid refusal, but with interest. What has today been like? What did I eat, and did it truly satisfy? How did I sleep? What is my stress doing? Am I physically hungry, understimulated, emotionally frayed, lonely, or simply in a habit loop that expects something at this hour? Those questions do not solve everything immediately, but they put a little light in the room. Perhaps that is what hunger is really trying to tell you much of the time. Not only feed me, though sometimes certainly that. Also, notice me. Notice your rhythms. Notice what keeps leaving you undernourished in ways that food alone cannot fix. Notice where the body has had to become loud because life has encouraged you to miss quieter needs. Notice how often appetite is not a failure, but a report. The body, doing what it can, saying in the clearest language it has left, something still needs tending here. And maybe that is not such a terrible thing to discover at the end of the day, because if hunger is only a problem to suppress, then every appetite becomes an argument. But if hunger is also a message to understand, then even its more difficult moments can become a little less hostile. The body stops looking like an adversary. It begins to look more like a companion that is not especially elegant with language but rarely malicious, always trying in its own persistent way to keep you alive, resourced, and moving toward what might restore you. So tonight, as you settle a little deeper into stillness, perhaps the gentlest thought to carry with you is that your body is not foolish for being hungry, and it is not weak for being complicated. Appetite is what happens when survival, memory, reward, stress, rhythm, and need all try to speak through the same narrow doorway. Of course, the message sometimes arrives crowded. Of course, it is not always easy to translate. Still, there is wisdom in continuing to listen. Because somewhere inside every ordinary hunger, whether it asks for dinner, for comfort, or for a little more care than the day has allowed, the body is still trying to guide you toward enough. And that quiet search for enough goes on with you into the next day, where another small signal begins to gather before you even have a name for it.